Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. King's Landing 305 AC. Aegon. After seeing Rhaegal take Cersei into the sky and knowing that his dragon would do what needed to be done, Aegon had looked around to make sure that those he cared about were unharmed. It had gone so much better than he had hoped for, even allowing Cersei to run when he had worked just as he wanted it to. Tavern had been the key, and the master now lay dead in the king's chambers, which had left Cersei with no one able to set the wildfire off. He would need to thank both Varys and Heimat for that piece of information, as without it, he'd perhaps have to have gone with the plan he told Heimat that he'd intended to use. As he now looked to the man as he and the other dragon guard climbed down from Drogon's back, none of them as quick or as graceful as his wife when she did so, he felt sympathy for him. She could not live, though, darn. The Reach in the realm itself demanded her death, and it would have needed to have been a far more gruesome one than the one Rhaegal had gifted her. "You are unharmed?" Dany said, grabbing him. As Aegon looked over her shoulder at Jaime, Brienne, and Jorah, two of them looking to him and his queen, while the others stared forlornly at the sky. "I am. It's done, Dany. We've taken the city," he said, smiling, as she kissed him. Her worries for him and her relief that they and those they cared about were unhurt, all seeming to be incorporated into that kiss. When they broke away from each other, he saw both Jorah and Brienne place their hands on their swords, and he turned to see Jon Connington and some men of the Golden Company come their way. Aegon motioning to the Dragon Guard to stand down and smiling when he saw Arya and Gendry walking from the Red Keep. "The Red Keep is yours, your graces," Jon said to them both, Aegon giving him a nod. And then he turned to whisper in Dany's ear before walking over to Jaime. He knew Rhaegal would be back soon, and that Cersei was long dead, and so he thought it best not to give the man any hope that she still lived. "I tried, Sir Osime. I had her, but when the mountain came in through the doors, the fighting began, and she escaped. I went after her, but Rosier," he said. And though he tried to put emotion in his voice and features, tried to sound upset, he knew that was it, not for the man's own upset. Then he'd not have believed his mummery. Did she suffer?" Jaime asked pleadingly. "It was quick, Sir Jaime. Dragons aren't like men, and they don't take pleasure in ending a life. He'll be back soon, and you can stand vigil for her, if you wish," he said, reaching out to touch the man's shoulder. "Thank you, Your Grace," Dany said, though there was no feeling in his words. Dany simply going through the motions, and for now, at least, there was no anger or hatred directed his way. Aegon knew that he'd need to be watched carefully, and he'd make sure that Varys, Arya, and Jorah all were more than aware of that. Leaving him there, he turned back and followed after his wife and the others, only for Arya to rush to him and embrace him just as Dany had, her eyes roaming over him to make sure he was unharmed. That he was doing likewise just as he had with Dany only proved that they were truly brother and sister once more. "You're not going to ask me if I'm unharmed?" he asked with a smirk. "No more than you would me," she said with a small laugh. Aegon mossing her hair, which she allowed this time. Nodding to Gendry, the three of them then walked into the Red Keep, and Arya told him all that had happened after he chased Cersei down. The Hound lived still, while his brother did not, and Aegon felt that was a fair enough trade. Dorne would appreciate seeing the Mountain was truly dead this time, considering what he had done to their prince, princess, and to Aegon's own brother. In that regard, he'd enjoy seeing the man's body also, as he was now starting to think of both Aegon and Rhaenys just as he always had of Arya or Robb. Arya said he was certain that Cersei was dead, and he told her that Rhaegal had seen to her. His little sister was annoyed that the green dragon had not torn her apart or set her aflame. Aegon deciding not to tell her that he needed the body, and so the dragon had crushed her to death. Instead, it was Arya that led the way. His sister had been here before, and he found himself following her lead. When they reached the throne room, it was to see Dany, Jorah, Brienne, and Jon Connington all already standing there. His wife was staring at the Iron Throne, but not moving to it, and so he walked up to her and took her by the hand. "Sit," he said softly in her ear, and she shook her head. "This is what you've been fighting for so long, for Dany. This is your birthright." "It's yours too," she said, turning to him. "Hey, but the moment means more to you, please, Dany." "For me," he said softly, and she nodded before kissing his cheek. He stepped back to allow her to walk up the steps herself. Aegon, like all the others in the room, looking on as she took her rightful place. Were he a different man, then he may have shed a tear when he saw the expression she wore. As it was, though, he only felt a sense of accomplishment. It was not to last too long, though, as he heard Drogon's roar, and instead of being in the throne room now, he was soon in it at a much different time. It took him a moment to clear that image from his head, her violet eyes looking so hurt and betrayed as he stabbed her through the heart, and only hearing her voice as she called out to him made him understand that it was a different life he lived now. She was alive, she was the queen, she was born to be, and they were soon to be a family. Aegon shook his head and promised himself that he would never dwell on such moments again. The wolf who did those things was dead, and only the dragon he now was could ever truly live. Aegon, Dany asked worriedly. The wildfire, we'll need to move it, he said, and she looked at him intensely for a moment as if she was seeking the lie in his truth, thankfully not finding it for now at least. We'll send men and speak to both Kinvara and Melora about it. Dany smiled, relaxing as he felt the final vestiges of the image fade from his mind. Her violet eyes now showing a much different look than the one that had haunted him so. We will, he said, kissing her lips, and then taking her by the hand. It took them some time for their army to secure the city completely. Jon and the Golden Company had done an excellent job, but both he and Dany wanted their men placed around the city so that everyone knew it was the dragons that ruled here now. Rosiel arrived back, and both he and Dany went out to greet him and to see for themselves the body he carried in his claws. She looked as if she was sleeping, and not as if she'd been crushed to death. Rosiel having done just enough to see her dead and to not leave her body disfigured. They allowed her to be brought to a room in the Red Keep to lay at rest. Her body would receive no special treatment, and Aegon wasn't even sure if her family would allow her to rest with her father and mother in Casterly Rock. It was a problem for another day, though, and after asking for rooms to be made ready for Princess Arianne and the other lords, and after making sure they all saw he was unharmed, at Varys' suggestion, Aegon felt ready for his bed. Today's problems were done with. On the morrow, they would begin to rule, and there were only more problems to come. He knew. Let's eat and sleep, he said to Dany, as they walked the room that he'd asked to be set up for them both. Is this Cersei's room? Dany asked when they entered it. I didn't think you'd wish to share the same bed that she and Euron Greyjoy did. Tomorrow we'll have everything in it removed, and make it our own. For now, this will have to serve as the royal chambers, he said, and she nodded. Their food arrived, and he looked to Arya and Missandei, who arrived with it. Missandei was carrying Lacareax, who flew to their bed as soon as they entered the room, and Arya told them that she'd seen to the food herself. Aryak smirking as he thought of her scaring the cooks, while making sure they weren't poisoning them. Though he was grateful that she would take the time to do so, especially when he saw it was clear that she was just as tired as he and Dany were. Go to your bed, Arya. We'll speak on the morrow, he said softly, kissing her cheek. As you command, your grace, she said, before ducking away from him and laughing when he pretended to slap her. Missandei told them both that Grey Worm had placed guards all through the Red Keep and the city, and that Jorah and Brienne were on guard outside their door. Yadi herself walking to tell one or both of them to go and get some sleep, and Aegon was unsurprised when neither did. After Missandei left them alone, they both ate most ravenously. He and Daddy had an appetite that Lyrax seemed to share, and just as they were ready to take to their bed for the night, Aegon felt Ghost close by. The White Wolf, too, had been hungry and had fed, his snout now covered in blood, and Aegon rubbed his fur as he led him into the room. It was just as well the bed was a large one, he thought, as he lay there with Dany in his arms. Lord Yerix and Ghost both had refused to sleep anywhere but the bed, and all thoughts of anything other than sleep for him and Dany were now out of the question. He didn't mind it as much as he thought he may. He was with his family, his wife, their babe and her dragon, and his wolf, other than a little sister who rested elsewhere in the Red Keep, and 2 dragons who were hunting in Backwater Bay. This was his entire family, an odd bunch, but mine own, he thought contentedly before he fell to sleep. King's Landing, 3:05 AC. Dany! She may love the Red Dragon and the White Wolf, but damn if they did not make for uncomfortable bedfellows. How Aegon managed to sleep so comfortably beside her with both of them on the bed as well, she didn't know. Whether it was that, the need to use the privy, or the excitement of the day to come, she couldn't be certain. Whatever the reason, she woke earlier than all 3 of her bed companions. And after being escorted to and back from the privy, she found herself almost curling up in laughter at the sight she returned to. On what just moments before had been her bed, her husband now rested with one arm around a white wolf that had laid its head on his chest. To his other side, Yaxliax too had moved from her original position, and though she didn't have Aegon's arm around her, she was snuggled up against him. He couldn't resist it, and so moving quietly to the door, she opened it, and placing a finger on her lips, she quickly bid Jorah and Brienne to follow her back inside. That the sound of their laughter woke him up was something she had hoped, but not planned for. Rosier looking confused at her, Brienne and Jorah before he looked to Ghost and Lyarex and shook his head. His own laughter soon joined theirs before he just lay back on the bed. Both Jorah and Brienne were still chuckling as they left the room, and Dany moved over to the bed before sitting down and facing her husband. "You would embarrass a king so," Aegon said, smiling as he did so. "I wish to have people share in the wondrous sight of a man with a beautiful wife who preferred to cuddle with his wolf and dragon than her." Dany said, trying not to smirk. "My wife is in a playful mood, it seems." Yaxon said, and he moved so quickly that she never had a chance to get away. "Aegon Targaryen, stop this at once. I am a queen," she said through her laughter, as he pinned her to the bed and made as if was to tickle her, his fingers threatening but not following through. "And I, king, we're equals in this bed. My love, and I command you, pay for your indiscretions," he said. Dany now laughing fully as his fingers began to tickle her, for true now. He carried on until she was breathless, both his tickling and her laughter leaving her so, and yet she laughed even louder when both Ghost and Lyarex looked at them almost annoyedly before moving from the bed. The red dragon flying to a couch and resting on it while Ghost walked over to where the fire was and lay down in front of it. "If I'd known that was all it took," Aegon said, making her laugh more, her breathing taking some time to come back to normal. Their fun couldn't last forever, though, and so, all too soon, she heard Missandei at their door. And with a far quicker kiss to Aegon's lips than she wished for, she rose from the bed and began to get ready for the day ahead. Aegon dressed even more quickly than she did, and soon enough, she, Lyarex, and Missandei were the only ones left in the room. "Your rooms are good?" she asked her friend. "Very much so, your grace," Missandei said. "It's warmer here, too," she said, and got a smile from Missandei in return. "Will you be crowned today, your grace?" Missandei asked. "I don't know what Aki has planned. I would hope so. I don't see the need for it, but both Achian and Ser Davos say it must be done. Usually in Westeros, it's done in the Great Septa by the High Septon, or so Ser Barristan would tell me," Dany said, feeling the same sadness she always did when she thought of her loyal knight. "He'd have been proud at what you've done here, your grace," Missandei said, noticing her sad look. "He should have been here with us," Dany said before turning to the girl and speaking to her as her friend and not her queen. "I'm so happy that you are with me, Missy. You know this, don't you?" "I know, Dany. I am too," Missandei said before pointing to her hair. "Something elaborate, perhaps." "Why not? I'm to be crowned a queen soon after all," she said to a beaming smile from the girl. After she was dressed and ready, Missandei walked with her, Ser Jorah, Grey Worm, and some of their men to the throne room. Dany entering to see Aegon sitting on the steps and speaking to some of the lords that had come expecting a battle, only to find them taking the city almost without one. She could tell that he'd been giving them his reasons for why he'd taken such a risk, and though she had known it was necessary and had been successful, it was one she'd ensure he never took again. After smiling at Ser Diaz, who stood a few feet from her husband, Dany walked over to where Aegon was sitting. "My queen," Aegon said, rising to his feet, his lips brushing against her cheek rather than her own, when she reached him. "My lords, princess," she said, turning to Arianne. "Princess Arianne was just telling me why Dorne should be given Cersei Lannister's body, my love," Aegon said, his annoyance clear. "And your response, my king?" she asked. "I told them they could not have it. They can have the Mountain's body and the princess, and others may see Cersei Lannister's, but the woman is dead, and I'll not have her paraded as a trophy. She's paid her debt with her life. Let her rest in peace," Aegon said, and Dany looked to Arianne and made it clear in her expression that she was with her husband on this. "We wish to discuss the small council, your grace," Lord Edric said, and she saw Aegon rolling his eyes at the man. "I believe we should discuss the coronation first. Don't you, my lords, princess?" she said to Nods. "Actually, our Lord Hand had a wonderful idea about that, my queen." "Didn't you, Davos?" Aegon said, and she saw the annoyed look that Davos shot Aegon, the man clearly not enjoying being put on the spot by her husband, who only shrugged and smirked when she looked at him. "I suggested to his grace that we do so outdoors, your grace." We would be showing the people that the old regime is no more and that you and his grace rule here now, Davos said. Something all already know, Lord Edric said, and it annoyed her as much as it did. Aegon, I think it's a wondrous idea, Lord Hand. The people should be a part of things, she said, and once she did, Lord Edric and the others quickly agreed. She was relieved when they didn't spend too much more time in the throne room. Aegon instead spoke to Ser Davos and to Lord Varys, and soon enough he was leading her to what she found out was the small council's rooms. Entering, she found Lady Kinvora and Lady Melora were already inside, and as Lord Varys and Ser Davos took a seat, Aegon asked Ser Jorah to stay, and then they too sat down. Lord Edric is far too forward, Your Grace. Varys said, and Dany looked to Aachen, who just nodded. I'll deal with him later. We've more important things to deal with first. Lady Kinvora, Lady Melora, what can be done with the wildfire? Aegon asked. It can't be shipped, Your Grace, as it is, but it can be left in place until it's ready to be disposed of. Lady Melora said, and Dany looked at the woman as if she was mad. Leave it in place. It could destroy the entire city, she said, and Melora nodded. It could, but it can be made harmless before it's moved and destroyed. If we were to place it in barrels filled with sand and then bury those barrels, it would be unable to be exploded, Your Grace. Lady Melora said, what if someone burst the barrel? Wouldn't the wildfire inside be exposed once the sand was removed? Aegon asked, and Melora shook her head. No, Your Grace. It would need to be poured over sand, not simply encased in it. It will take some time, but it can be done. Very well, I'll organize the men to see to it. Lord Varys, other than Doran, how do we fare with the realm as a whole? She asked. We have the North Reach, Riverlands, Westerlands, Stormlands, and the Iron Islands. The Crown Lands will come now we've taken the city, and so that leaves only the Vale, Varys said. And what do we know of them? Lord Vortiax. Aegon asked. My little birds tell me that the Lords of the Vale march as we speak, Your Grace, to King's Landing, Varys said. They're coming to pledge their fealty, Davos said, smiling. It would seem that way, Varys said, making her look to Aegon, who nodded. That would be it. Other than Dorne, they'd now control the entire realm. They truly were the king and queen of the Seven Kingdoms. We need to decide the makeup of a small council, Lord Hand, Aegon said, looking to Davos. Master of Whisperers we have, Your Grace, as we do, Lord Commander of the Dragon Guard, which leaves Master of Coin Ships, Laws, a Grand Maester, and perhaps a new hand, Davos said. We're perfectly happy with the hand we have, Sir Davos, she said, seeing Aegon's pleased look that she said it before him. Then for Master of Ships, I'd suggest Lord Redwine. His fleet is the biggest in Westeros now, Davos said. Lady Melora, does your father or one of your brothers wish for a role on the council? Aegon asked, and then the woman shook her head. They do not, Your Grace. I believe House Hightower is best placed to be named Warden of the South, and there is the matter of Highgarden to be resolved. But the council, no, Melora said. Then Lord Radwine it is, Daenerys said, before asking. Master of Coin Laws, I know Lord Edric will wish one of them, but I don't wish to give the man that much power. Lord Jon served both our fathers, and I'd see him given a role, Aegon said. Doran will wish for something too, perhaps, she said, and Aegon nodded. We'll speak to Princess Arianne after the coronation. For now, let's take it as the names we've decided upon, and once Lord Jon decides which role he wants, we'll see the other is filled. This is not the end of things, and we have more wars to fight. Dorne needs to be brought back into the fold, and that fight won't wait for long, Aegon said. She waited until they'd all left and moved closer to her husband, Aegon taking her hand in his as he looked into her eyes. This is just a beginning, Daddy, but our house's rise begins here, and when we're done, our children will never know the fear that you and I have known, or the danger. I swear it to you. They'll live in a world at peace. Aegon said, and she nodded. Even if we need to bring fire and blood before then, she asked. We must. For them we must, he said, before she kissed him. King's Landing 305 AC. Lady Anya Waynwood. They had marched hard and fast. Anya, the Lords of the Vale, and almost 10,000 men, half of them knights, and mounted. Yet reaching the city they were too late. She almost felt like she was Walder Frey, and it vexed her terribly. The city had fallen. The dragons now ruled, and as she looked at the walls of King's Landing with the others, Lords Declarant, it stunned her to see the lack of damage. Not just to the walls themselves, but even the gates were still intact. Anya and the other lords of the Vale had almost expected to find King's Landing aflame, and she wondered why it was not. Had the dragons not been used? Did they even exist? No. She knew they did. The men who'd come back from the north had been insistent on that, and Anya had no reason to doubt them. Still, it gave her some pause, and were it not for the fact that the men who guarded the walls were clearly unsullied, and that King's Landing was surrounded by an army of horse lords, then she'd perhaps think that Cersei Lannister still ruled here. Looking to the men with her, the escort she'd been allowed to bring along with her other lords as they rode towards the gate, Anya could see them thinking just as she was. She could see Harry was looking lost, and she hoped that he did as he was bid and spoke respectfully. It had been something she'd done her very best to make clear to him on this ride. Something that she believed he'd taken to heart, but would only know for sure once they stood face to face with the king and queen. If you wish your claim to be accepted, then you must show them you're worthy, Harry. All your usual activities will not be tolerated by them or by me, she said firmly. Had Miranda been allowed? No, we do not know what their graces may have in mind. They could decide to suggest a bride for you before they give you the veil. You must appear to be more than you are. Do you understand? She said, taking his face between her hands. I do, he said, and she smiled before kissing his cheek. She would see him named as Lord and Warden if he left it up to her, but men were more prideful than most women, and they at times didn't know their place. Smart men, clever men, foolish men, she dealt with them all, and had always charted her own course. Even when she'd seemed to acquiesce to their wishes as she had with Littlefinger, she'd only done so to gain an advantage. When you were strong, you acted weak, and when you were weak, you acted strong. Women knew this far better than most men did. She had found men's pride made them fear looking weak. A woman's place in the world that she lived in made her understand the greater danger was in looking too strong. Ahead of her, she heard the Dothraki who had led them this far were now speaking to the men who guarded the gates. The Unsullied and the Horse Lords both speaking in some form of bastard Valyrian that she didn't understand. Thankfully, she had men who did, and soon enough, one of her guards told her that they'd just been speaking of who they were, and that they'd soon be escorted into the city itself. Anya, using the time they had to think of how to approach the king and queen and the right time to speak of Sansa Stark. We're being allowed in, Harry said, and she nodded before riding into the city for the first time in almost 50 years. At her age, she'd have preferred to ride in a carriage, but she was not averse to riding on a horse. And after hearing that the queen herself rode, Anya felt she may feel a little kinship seeing a woman of her years riding also. It had certainly garnered her some looks from the Dothraki, and though they were foreign to her and their words unknown, she had felt they had been pleased to see her ride and not to be another of those ladies of Westeros who did not. The city, just like the walls and gates, seemed remarkably undamaged, and though there were some signs of fighting, it was far less than she had expected. Anya, though, soon wondered where the people were, as it seemed to be far less busy than she had expected. Why soon became clear as they rode further into the city and the streets became fuller. In the distance, she could see even larger crowds, and as she looked, she saw the large open space where the great sept of Baelor had once stood. She shook her head at the sight and prayed to the gods, the thoughts of what that crazed lioness had done not quite matching up to the image of seeing the damage she'd left behind. On the steps, look, Sierra Seaman said, and she looked to see the king and queen standing there, surrounded by lords, ladies, and guards. There was also a man who was obviously a septon of some sort standing off to one side holding something in his hands. A coronation? She asked, and when she looked closer and realized that it was, she bid the other lords move even more quickly. It took some shoving, thankfully not too much, and eventually they made it to the steps before they were stopped by some Unsullied and a large woman wearing a white cloak. They were asked who they were, and Anya stepped forward to tell her. At a nod from the king and queen, they were then brought up the steps. Anya and the rest of the Lords Declarant stood to one side, and she looked to the others who were there before looking back at the king and queen. She could see Dornishmen and a woman that she believed may well be Princess Arianne. There were also some Westerlands men, including at least one Lannister. She almost gasped when she saw Lord Leyden Hightower and his sons, along with Paxter Redwine and some other Lords of the Reach. A man stood with some of the Storm Lords that looked remarkably like a young Robert Baratheon, though compared to the man who stood next to a girl who wore a sword at her hip, not as truly. She could see Lord Varys, an older man who wore the pin of the hand of the king, a woman dressed in red who was clearly one of the Red Priestesses, and another woman who wore white. There were more unsullied, some Dothraki, and a dark-skinned woman, and then the king and queen themselves. It was clear that the queen was who she said she was, her silver hair and violet eyes, reminding Anya so very much of Queen Regiada. As for the king, at first glance he looked like Ned Stark reborn, but the closer you looked, the less that seemed true. His hair was much darker, and as for his eyes, she'd not seen eyes like that since Harrenhal. Aegon Targaryen may not have his father's coloring, but he had his looks, and he most definitely had his eyes. We are here to crown their graces, Queen Daenerys and King Aegon of the House Targaryen. The Septon said, stepping forward, the oils in his hand as he brushed first Aegon and then Daenerys' foreheads. She watched as rather than the Septon it was the king himself who took the crown from the pillow that the Red Priestess held. The queen then dropping to her knees as the king moved closer to her. I name you Queen Daenerys Targaryen, Queen of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lady of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realms of Men, Aegon said, his voice carrying in the quiet of the square before the cheers then rang out. The queen walked to the woman in white who held her own pillow in front of her, the crown resting on it, and soon it was in her hands as she turned to walk back to where Aegon was now kneeling. I name you King Aegon Targaryen, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realms of Men, Daenerys said, the cheers starting as soon as she had done so. It surprised her when they kissed each other and how intense that kiss was, the crowd cheering even more loudly when they saw it. The king and queen, long may the reign, the man wearing the hand's pin shouted. Long may the reign, long may the reign. House Targaryen, fire and blood. The cheers rang out and Anya herself cheered loudly. She wasn't yet sure if she bought into the new king and queen as enthusiastically as those cheering did, but she wasn't going to be marked out as someone who hadn't cheered. How right they were, for the realm would be proven in time. How right they were for her ambitions even sooner. No matter what they were, far better than the woman who had sat on the throne last. And as she turned, she saw a red dragon fly and land in front of them. The dragon then let out a not-so-loud roar, and it confused her for a moment. Though when two far louder roars rang out and her eyes went to the sky, it did not. The dragons ruled here now for true, Anya thought, as a black and green dragon flew over them all. The Riverlands 305 AC. Sansa, they'd given her food and some coin, though nothing more than enough to buy her and Theon some nights at a tavern. Once they'd reached the Crossroads Inn, they'd been left alone. Sansa finally realizing just how true that actually was now. After renting a room, taking a much colder bath than she would like, and eating a decent enough meal that she welcomed more for its hotness than its taste, she began to try and formulate some plan. 3 days later, and she had still not been able to come up with one, and Theon's idea to go to the Iron Islands was becoming more and more like the best option. At least there he would be the brother to a queen. Though Sansa doubted that the dragon whore would live up to the bargain she'd struck with Yara and Meereen, even if Theon did not. Queen or not, Yara was, and would be in charge of the Iron Islands, and though Sansa was under no illusion that it would be anything like the life she had in Winterfell or the one she'd been building in the Vale, it would be a more comfortable life than the one that faced them both now. Yet, she could not agree to it. She could not give in so easily. They'd taken far too much from her, and to simply accept it and move on was something she'd sworn she'd not do. But what else could she do? What other options were there for her? She couldn't think straight, and it worried her that there were so few options even to titter. The North was out to her. No doubt by now Jon had gifted her home to someone else. Perhaps even to Arya, as if anyone could make her accept being Lady of Winterfell. It would be her favorite brother. It would be yet another dagger to her heart, usurped by her sister now as well as her bastard brother. The Vale was lost to her, and she would not be welcome in King's Landing. If anything, Cersei would see her lose her head before she ever welcomed her there. If Cersei even lived anymore, that was. Sansa had listened as people spoke of the army that had marched past and of the dragons who led it, and she'd not be surprised if King's Landing was theirs already. Everything else was, after all, things just came so easily to them both. The North, the South, their crowns, all were practically handed to them while she struggled and suffered. It left her with so few options, and in the end, she knew that she only really had the one. Family, duty, honor, those were the words of her mother's house, and River Run belonged to House Tully. once more. She needed to find family that would support her, and while her uncle had not answered her raven when she'd gone to the Vale, perhaps he'd listen to her if she spoke to him herself. Even if he did not, staying in the house her mother was born in would be far more comfortable and fitting for a lady such as her than a tavern. It was all she could do, and so she resolved to speak to Theon about it once he returned. Sansa was happy she didn't have to wait too long as he knocked at the door and entered the room a little over an hour later. "King's Landing has fallen, Sansa," Theon said, taking a seat across from her. "How?" she asked, though her mind knew the how. And it was really how it had fallen so soon that she wished to know. "I don't know. Some riders came and said that Cersei Lannister is dead and the dragons rule once more. Ravens have been sent throughout the realm, and he was riding from hearing it said in Harrenhal," Theon said. "They've sent the ravens?" she asked, and Theon nodded. It changed things, and it did not. River Run was still her only plan, and so it would be to River Run that she'd go, but she'd need to be far more careful once she got there. Pleading to her uncle to rise up for her was no longer an option. Not only would the Riverlands army have no chance against the Dragon Whores, but if they had taken King's Landing, they were king and queen now for true. Now, she could perhaps still suggest a Grand Council, but she'd need to understand more of who she could call upon first, before doing so. Without the North and the Vale, she had nothing to offer, and there was no reason for her to be given any consideration without the annulment from the faith. That was something she had not received and would now be much harder to get with Robin dead. She wondered if she could blame her cousin's death on Jon somehow, say that he saw him killed to ensure that she was left powerless and so couldn't contest his claim on the North. It could be a way to go, but she needed to know what he'd done with the North and in whose hands he'd left it. If Arya ruled there now, then she was done for. But perhaps she could be lucky and her sister would prove what both she and her mother had known about her all their lives, that she was no lady. "Sansa," Theon said, taking her from her thoughts. "Sorry, my mind was elsewhere," she said, trying to smile at him and only half succeeding. "Have you given any thought to the Iron Islands? Yaga would accept us both, and see we're cared for. I know it's not Winterfell, but I'd see you safe and looked after," he said softly. She smiled a fuller, truer smile at his words, and then got up from her seat. The kiss she gave him on the cheek was a token of her appreciation for all he'd done for her and all he'd said he'd do. It was one of gratitude, and though she saw how he looked at her and knew that, should she ask it of him then, he'd make her his wife, it was no more than that. While the thoughts of marrying someone who would have no needs of that nature did appeal, Daeon brought her no more as a husband than he did as a friend, and so she needed to remain unwed, just in case she found someone that did. "We should ride to River Run, Theon. My uncle is there, and he'd see us comfortable, and from there we can decide what needs to be done. Should we wish to travel to the Iron Islands, then we can be escorted to Seaguard and go from there," she said, and he nodded. She still had no intent on going to the Iron Islands, but for now it was best if Theon felt it still an option. Since the day was half over already, they decided to stay in the inn for another night and leave on the morrow. They ate with the other patrons, and more news of what had happened in King's Landing was being shared around the tavern. Sansa not sure if she believed any of it, other than the fact that King's Landing had indeed fallen. After breaking their fast, early the next morning, Theon saddled their horses and they set off for River Run. The thoughts of seeing the keep her mother had been born and raised in were ones that made the early part of their journey seem far swifter to her. Sansa not even minding sleeping out under the stars as much as she had when they marched from Winterfell or headed to the Vale. The milder weather of the Riverlands may have had something to do with that also, she thought. She was not made for the cold of the north. Sansa had always belonged in the sun, in the south, and was it not for others would be queen there now. They'd been riding almost a week when they reached their first keep. Stonehenge was not what it once was, but it was a welcome sight, and when Lord Bracken heard who she was, he welcomed them both into his hall. "Your companion, Lady Sansa?" Lord Bracken asked, looking to Theon. "Ellen, my lord. A guard for milady," Theon said, sticking to the story they'd come up with, both of them knowing that he'd not be given a fond welcome in the Riverlands. "Just the one guard, Lady Sansa?" Lord Bracken asked confusedly. "I had more, my lord, but they abandoned us at the Crossroads Inn," she said to outraged shouts. "What sort of men were these?" Lord Bracken said, and Sansa almost smiled as she sensed an opportunity to begin to sow some seeds of doubt. After bathing in a warm bath with some scented oils and been given a clean dress that belonged to one of Lord Bracken's daughters, She then ate with the Lord and his family while Theon ate with some of the men. Sansa told a tale of issues with her bastard brother and how she feared that she was somehow in the way of things between Jon and the dragon whore. That while she did not, at that time at least, fear for her life, she knew she was not welcome, and so, when they marched south, she sought out her cousin in the Vale. She made it clear that she wasn't completely aware of the situation in the Riverlands, and that since she'd asked for aid from her granduncle once before and been denied, she had feared asking again. Then she told of how Robin had been so very sweet to her, how despite them being cousins they'd fallen deeply for each other, and then to her horror he'd been killed. Again she made it clear that she didn't think Jon or the dragon whore were involved, but that it had been most odd and who else had stood to gain. By the time she was done, she felt she'd brought him to her side, at least enough that one day he may support her. "I shall see you escorted to your uncle, my lady. Once there we can get to the truth of things. Perhaps this is all a misunderstanding, and it's simply the life you've endured, which makes you so wary," Lord Bracken said, and she smiled at him as she nodded. "I hope for nothing more, my lord," she said, though she knew that was certainly not the truth. She hoped for many things: vengeance, justice, and a crown for her head. Dorne 3005 AC. Malakul Maegir. While the weather in this god-forsaken place was similar enough to his homeland, it was all that was. The food, the wine, the people, all of it irked him. And listening to men beneath him question him was something he would not put up with for much longer. Why this fool of a prince was to be his guide in such a place was beyond him. Belite's instructions had been clear, though, and for now, Melako would live by them. "Let him think himself in charge, Mako. Let him think his agenda and our own are the same," Melako said. "He is a fool. I'll not have a fool command our men," he said annoyedly. "Nor would I, you command the army, but let him think him in charge of the goals. See him take his country back and from there move on," Bellico said. "And the wolves?" he asked, almost licking his lips at the thought of what he'd do to them. "Are few and far between, my friend, though the one leads the army you face is a favored brother, I believe." "Robb Stark's brother?" he asked eagerly. "Bastard brother, but most beloved," Bellico said, and he had smiled at that. Dorne and then Westeros, Malakwo. "See it done." "Dorne and then Westeros, as you command." Meliko replied. Dorne was easy enough, a skirmish when they landed, and then a quick surrender, though it had irked him that there was no true fight. He did, however, take pleasure in how irked the frog was when he found out that his sister, Dorne's lords, and most of their army were not here. As much as the man may have tried to claim the taking of a city of sand was a great victory, without a true battle no one else would see it that way. And so it had turned out to be. Malako smiled at the blatant disrespect shown to the frog. He'd not accept it when directed at him, as men had already found out to their cost. But seeing it shown to the so-called Prince of Dorne amused him, never more so than at the feast the fool threw himself to celebrate his great victory. The lack of enthusiasm shown by the men in the great hall was something that the foolish boy never even noticed. All he saw was the glasses raised. All he heard was the cheers. Had he been a different, cleverer man then, he'd have looked at the hate in the eyes that watched him as they did so. For a man whose house's words were unbowed, unbent, and unbroken, the frog had somehow thought that taking a city without winning a battle would leave these men any of those things. Only when he'd sent ravens threatening the families of the absent lords and received no replies, and then when the food shipments began to be delayed, did it dawn on him that he was not as in control as he believed. Then, like the boy he was, he'd ranted, raved, and punished the messengers rather than send a message himself. It was the final straw for Malakwo, and so he'd gone to speak to the frog and fed him the words he'd wished to hear. "I shall take my men and march on some of these keeps. Let them know what it is they are to face should they not comply," Malakort said, standing opposite the Frog Prince and looking down on the map. "I need my army here. My whore of a sister will return, and I need to be ready." "She has no ships, does she not?" he asked. And the frog nodded. "Then she'll need to march. Here," he said, pointing at the Bolnway. "You'll wait for here there?" the frog asked, smiling. "We'll beat her there. Then once done, I can march my men into the land of storms," he said, pointing to the Stormlands. "What about the dragons?" the frog asked. "There's been no word from your man?" he asked to a shake of the head. "The mountains will provide cover if they come, but once your sister hears of Dorne's fall, then she'll not wait for them. If what you say of her is true, she'll not. Arianne is impetuous and reckless once her temper is up. The frog said, "Then you must ensure her temper is up. Send the ravens and declare yourself the rightful ruler of Dorne," he said, and the frog smiled. Malakako cared not for Dorne, for the frog, or for his whore of a sister. It was blood he sought. Westerosi blood, and the blood of wolves most of all. His ships set sail within the week. The ravens were sent, and the realm would hear of Dorne's new prince. It wasn't to the Bonway that he would bring his men, though, and he cared not that Quentyn and Dorne would fall to the dragons or to his sister. He came for blood, and to settle a score. "Where to Treyarch?" his captain asked. "The north, I've wolves that need killing." "King's Landing 305 AC, Gendry." Each time he tried to get near the king to speak to him, he'd been denied. He wasn't been avoided, and he knew should he press it further, then Aegon would grant him an audience, but Gendry knew that he was busy. That he was also incredibly nervous about the conversation made him more than happy to delay it. Also, Aegon never pressed him on it either. She knew his reasons for needing to speak to her brother, and she'd made her own feelings clear. Her determination to see them wed was something that he was at times at a loss to understand. He was happy for it, happier than he'd ever been. In fact, but it had feared that it would never be something she'd wish for them. At best, he'd thought that she may have spent time with him, that they may have been a part of each other's lives for some time, until she decided that it was time to move on. His love was a wild wolf, and it was that, among the many other things that made her who she was, that he loved her for her to wish to be his for the rest of their lives. That had been a welcome surprise, and one that he'd taken some time to come to terms with. With it being not just possible but likely, he'd resolved to make sure that he did it right, and so as he saw Aegon walking to the sparring yard with Sir Jaime, he made his presence known. "Your Grace," he called out, and it was Sir Jaime who turned first. "Gendry," Aegon said when he saw him, and Sir Jaime relaxed. "Your Grace, I was wondering if we may speak," he said nervously. "I was heading to the yard. Is it important?" Aegon asked, and Gendry looked at him and almost lost his courage. "It is, Your Grace. It's about Princess Arya," he said, and saw the smirk appear on Aegon's face. "Don't let my sister hear you call her that, otherwise you'll end up with very painful shins," Aegon said, and Gendry chuckled at that, knowing that all too well from their time traveling together. "Walk with me," Aegon said a moment later. He nodded and hurried over to join the king and his dragon guard. The three of them now walking towards the sparring yard. It took him almost until they were there before he could actually get the words out, the king's expression never changing at all while he spoke them. "I love her, Your Grace, your sister and I. She wishes us to be wed, and I know what I am and who she is, and I know I've nothing to offer her other than that she already has. I love her, though, truly and with all I am, and I ask your permission for us to marry," he said, as Aegon looked at him. They'd stopped just before reaching the sparring yard. Aegon was now staring at him, and Gendry found himself swallowing more than once. "Does my sister know that you're here asking this of me?" Aegon asked. "Not that I'm here now, Your Grace, that I intended to do so." "Hey, she knows," he said, and was confused when Aegon started looking him over, the king moving to the side and back of him before coming to stand in front of him once he'd done. "Your Grace," he asked, "I was just checking for holes. How have you not got any after telling Arya that you were asking her brother for her hand?" Riordan said before laughing and looking at him. "I ask myself the same question, Your Grace," Gendry said with a soft smile on his face. "I love my sister, Gendry. I had thought her lost to me, feared it even after we'd been reunited. Her happiness is something that I desire as much as anything in this world. Any man with eyes to see would know you make her happy, but," Aegon said. "But," he said, gulping only to be slapped on the head, and to look to the king completely confused. "Now, only a fool would ever ask any man, even a king, for her hand. So you can tell her that I slapped you softer than she would, and that though it's not needed, you have my blessing and my permission." Aegon said, and Gendry found himself nodding. "Now, since you're here, there is something you can do for me in return. I ask you to simply play along, Gendry," Aegon said with a smirk. He nodded to the king and followed him into the sparring yard. Gendry looking around to see some Dornishmen fighting with spears and some Reach and Westerland men facing off. He saw some Stormland knights surrounding a man not that much younger than himself. A man that he could see looked very much like him. Lord Yaxley. "Aegon," said, and the man walked their way. "Your Grace," Edric said with a bow. "I was wondering if you'd care to spar my lord." Aegon asked, and Edric nodded before he looked to him, a confused look on his face and on the faces of some of the Stormlands lords when he did so. "I'd be honored, your grace," Edric said. Gendry watched as Avagan handed Sir Jaime his sword. The look on people's faces when they saw it was the same one that he no doubt wore on his own. Everyone had known the king bore Longclaw for more years than he'd care to remember. Right now, though, the sword in Sir Jaime's hand was Blackfire, the sword of kings, and he felt Aegon was sending a not-so-subtle message by wearing it. He looked on as the king picked out a tourney sword and as Adric did the same, the two men turning to face each other while around them the other spars had come to an end. More than one person keener to see the king spar than to take part in their own, it seemed. "To 5 or a yield, Lord Edric," Aegon said, and Edric nodded. What followed wasn't so much a spar as an exhibition, and Gendry felt that Lord Edric, who he was now more than certain was his bastard brother, would be wearing bruises for a fair few days. Aegon wasn't just faster and more accomplished than Edric, he was focused in a way that few men were. That focus today at least seemed to be on teaching a lesson, and so that was what he did. The first and second strikes caught Edric on the shoulders, the third and fourth on the knees, all 4 landing within the space of a moment, and to no reply. The last was more a question of when and not if, and it came only when the king wished it so. Gendry looked to the balcony above to see Arya, Missandei, Princess Arianne, and some others look on. None, though, as interested as the queen who stood smiling as she watched. "I yield, your grace," Edric said as the king took his feet and threatened to bring the sword down hard onto his head, stopping the blow before it reached it and holding it no more than an inch from Edric's helm. "Well fought, Lord Edric," Aegon said, helping him to his feet, and Gendry and all the others who had watched could tell he meant not what he said. "I thank you, your grace, for the spar," Edric said politely, though the look on his face was anything but thankful. "Perhaps we can do so again sometime, my lord," Yaxon said, and he heard Edric say how much that would please him, though he doubted he meant it. Aegon glanced up at the queen and smiled before he moved his way. Gendry then saw Ser Davos speak to the queen, and they turned and left. Aegon quickly changed direction and moved to the stairs. There follow after the hand and the queen. Gendry looked to the Stormlords and Lord Edric, who were now staring at him, and then he turned to face the stairs to see Arya walking towards him, the smile on his face a true one as he moved to tell her his news. King's Landing 305 AC. Aegon. He and Dany spent a few days in the rooms they were given before moving to the King's Chambers, or the newly named Royal Chambers, as it would serve them both. And not just he alone. Neither had a wish to be parted or to have separate rooms, and Missandei and Jon Connington, surprisingly, had done a great job in making the rooms suitable for them both. They'd held small council meetings, and though they still needed to name a master of coin, they'd almost filled it out, which had then allowed them to concentrate on other things. The first of these had been Dorne, and so they'd asked for Princess Arianne, Sir Daemon Sand, who led her armies, and Ned Dane to come and speak to them so they could plan what to do about the new prince. When the Raven had arrived, Dany had sent for Princess Arianne, and she'd been wroth to read it, though knowing that she had their complete support in regaining her throne had at least stayed her hand. "They'll expect you to march the Bone Way. Were it me, that's where I'd lay in wait," Aegon said as they spoke of their plans. "Will not march, your grace?" Sir Daemon asked. "Her grace and I will give you the use of our ships, as will Lord Redwine. We'll sail to Dorne and bypass any traps they've set for us. We'll bring half the Dothraki and half the Unsullied. And her grace and I will fly as escort to the ships," he said. "We cannot take Sunspear with dragons, your grace," Arianne said worriedly to Dany. "Nor will we. They will see them, though. They'll see Drogon and Rhaegal's flames, and the men will fear them," Dany said. "We take the city with men. Our forces, Dorne's, we take the city with men. And once the city has fallen, we then deal with the men in the Bonway, and it'll be those men who will face our dragons." Aegon said to nods of agreement. After they'd made their plans clear, they'd called for Melora and Kinvara, and once again asked them to seek answers for their gods. Melora told them that she'd sent ravens to Dorne to seek answers, and Kinvara said she'd look into the flames. Then they'd begun to make the plans for naming their Lord Paramounts, Wardens, seeing the lords rewarded who deserved it, and for a million other things that he had never thought he'd need to deal with. It was with this that he'd found Dany far stronger than he. His wife had a knack for the political side of things that he did not. True, both of them could be rash and impulsive, but it was in different aspects of ruling that this showed up. Aegon was far easier to lose his temper dealing with lords and ladies than Dany was, and his wife was far angrier with their enemies than he. He could be and was ruthless, and after all he'd seen in his life, he was far more willing to lie and tell half-truths than he had ever been. For Aegon, though, these served larger goals than the lies and half-truths that were needed in dealing with those in court every day. He had lied to TARGERIYAN about his sister and brother because it was needed, while he'd not told everyone of plans he may make because other than Dany they did not need to know. His circle of trust was growing, but it was still very small, and though he foresaw a day when he would think his family safe, that day was not this one, and so he would remain vigilant and forgo his honor. I mean's words, the ones that he would live by now. What is honor compared to a woman's love? The spar with Edric had been a lesson, two in fact, though the second would take more time to sink in, he felt. When Gendry married his sister, then the Lord of Storm's End would see the second lesson that Aegon had wished for him to learn. Edric was not the only son of Robert Baratheon in the realm, and only one of them held his favor. Aegon smiled at that as he stood in the throne room, his queen sitting on the Iron Throne as they awaited the passengers from this ship from Essos that concerned her so. Aegon found his thoughts drifting to Gendry once more. He had to admit it had surprised him when he'd been asked for Ari's hand, and so he'd had some fun with the man. Gendry had already gotten permission from the only one that mattered, and asking him was a waste of time. Still, he could understand why Gendry had done so, as the stain of one's birth was one that Aegon knew all too well. If it were not for the need of the Stark name to continue, then he'd name the man true, as a Baratheon, but he could not, and so on. That Lord Edric would take some comfort. The threat, though, would be there for some time, and he'd let the man sweat for now. Diario Naharis, the herald announced, and Aegon heard his wife's gasp. The man who walked into the room was exactly as he had imagined him, cocky, self-assured, and the looks he gave his wife were ones that would see most men dead. Aegon looked to Dany and saw the look of anger on her face, and had he any doubts of his wife's love for him, which he had not, then that look alone would have ended them. No woman or man would look upon a former love that they had still had feelings for that way. Even Naharis's cocky swagger seemed taken aback by it, and Aegon resisted the urge to smile. "My queen," Daario said, with an over-elaborate bow. "Why are you here?" Dany asked, and Aegon could see her gripping her hands tightly. "I come with grave news, my queen. Perhaps we can speak in private," Daario said, glancing at him, and Aegon saw how he gave him a once-over before he turned from him and was now looking at Dany once more. "Speak of it now, and waste no more of my time." Dany said, her voice tight as she held back her emotions. "Meereen is fallen, your grace. I barely escaped with my life," Daario said. "Out, all of you. Leave us," he said, and Grey Worm's men moved forward. The lords, ladies, and even their council leaving the room. He looked to Arya and nodded to Jaime, Jorah, and Brienne, and shook his head. Aegon had no fear that he could protect his queen alone from the man if he had come with some other motive, but he'd take no chances just in case. When everyone had left, Daenerys rose from the throne, her anger even more clear now as she moved toward Daario. Aegon stepping forward as she did. "You lost my city," she said angrily. "We were overwhelmed, my queen. The army and ships that came at us were even larger than the one that attacked us before, and we had no dragons." Daario said. "Who?" Dany asked. "I saw Volantian sails, Giscari, and others." Daario said, and Aegon saw how much his words upset his wife, and as much as he knew she wished to know more, now was not the time. "Leave us," he said, and Daario glared at him. "And you are?" Daario asked. "The man who will end you where you stand, should you not leave," he said. "I take orders only from my queen, not her." The slap to Daario got was a painful one to Aegon's eyes, even Ser Jaime and Ser Jorah wincing as Dany held her hand after striking the man's face. "My king told you to leave. Leave before you wake mine own dragon. We shall send for you at our pleasure," Dany said. Aegon watched as the man looked to him before turning to walk from the throne room. The welcome was perhaps not the one Daario had expected, but he'd lost his queen, her city, and so he was lucky to be walking from the room at all. Once he'd gone, Aegon moved to Dany, her eyes tear-filled as she looked at him. "They are my people. I promised them a life without chains. I failed them," she said, as he took her in his arms. "No, failing them would be if we do nothing. Then if you do nothing, do you intend to do nothing? Do you intend to let them be chained once more? He asked, and she shook her head. No, I am their Misa. I broke their chains once, and I'll do so again. But I'll not stop with theirs. I'll not stop until all the chains are broken, she said, determined. Will not stop, my love, he said, as she nodded. And he saw a small smile appear on her face. We will make a new world, Aegon, you and I, a free world where the only choice is to live in our new world or die in their old one. And those who think they know better, those who think their world is the right way, who think they offer people another choice, they don't get to choose, Dany said as she kissed him. Aegon remembering the words from a different time, remembering how they had made them feel. And when the kiss stopped and he looked into her eyes, he knew the truth. She was right. She'd always been right, and together they'd usher in a new world. King's Landing 305 AC. Aegon. He'd rarely seen her this upset, and so the night was spent together. Just the two of them with Ghost and Lyarox. The red dragon, just like the white wolf, almost seeming to act as pillows for his wife when he would move to get her something. Stand up to fetch her some food, and Ghost would take his place on the couch. Move to speak to someone at the door, and when he turned back, Lyarox would be in her arms. When he took her to bed, she almost clung to him as she slept, and he spent most of the night awake and holding her in his arms. Each time she'd shiver or shudder, he'd run his fingers through her hair or softly stroke her back until she stilled. Aegon not needing to see into her head to know that the dreams she was having were bad ones. They'd not spoken of Esses much, other than the tales of what she had done there, and he believed she was feeling guilty about leaving them alone. His wife's heart was too big and too pure for this world, and right now it was hurting, and as he softly kissed her forehead, he swore he'd make those responsible pay dearly for that. Waking up the next morning was like waking to a completely different woman. Dany had done her crying in her sleep, and though there was still sadness in her eyes, there was determination there too. They broke their fast, and she sent for Grey Worm and Missandei, Aegon leaving them alone even though she didn't ask him to. He knew the three of them shared something that he had not been a part of, and so could offer each other words that he didn't have. Instead, he moved to the sparring yard to take his own frustrations out there. Feel up for a spar, Sir Jaime? He asked as they walked, the knight giving him a small smile and a nod. As usual, when he reached the sparring yard, it was to find it remarkably full. Whether this was how life at court usually went, or that people were just striving to keep in shape for the battles to come, he couldn't tell. His arrival created a stir, though, and as he and Jaime lined up to face each other, he could see some of those sparring stop to look. Jaime, though, one-handed, and that being his offhand, had gotten better since the fight with the dead. He may not be a true match for him, but it wasn't an easy win either. And the two of them were both smiling by the time they were done. He looked around for another opponent, and found that Ned Dane had finished his own spar, Aegon quickly waving the man over so they could face each other. The younger man was the very best opponent he'd faced, even including the Night King, and their spars soon drew even more interest. Blackfire against Dawn also ensuring that all eyes in the sparring yard were on them as the two blades clashed. It was fast, frenetic, and were they not as good as they both were then? One of them would have certainly been hurt, Aegon finally taking the match with a feint and a crashing down of his sword's hilt onto the hand that held Dawn. Hearing the sound of clapping, he turned to see the sellsword standing on the balcony with a smug look on his face. His hands coming together almost in a mocking manner as he looked down at him and Ned. Only the knowledge that if he faced him now then he'd not hold back stopped him from running up the stairs and dragging him down to place a sword in his hand. Dario was lucky that his wife still needed him to tell her what exactly had happened in Moraine, and even luckier that Arya was, for once, not here. Aegon may have been able to hold in his anger he doubted his little sister would have, and seeing the man gutted, though amusing, would not be productive. That man is a fool, Your Grace, Ned said as they shared some water. Fools are easy to predict, Ned. They'll do foolish things each and every time. Give me a fool over a clever man, any day, he said to a chuckle. When do you think we'll be heading for Dorne, Your Grace? Ned asked. We have some appointments to be made here, and then once those are done, we'll load up the ships and set sail. Eager to see your homeland again? He asked as he swallowed his water. My aunt is in Sunspear, Your Grace, Ned said softly. He moved over to the younger man and placed a hand on his shoulder before Ned turned to look at him. I give you my oath, whatever it takes, we'll see your aunt is unharmed, he said. And Ned nodded. I thank you, Your Grace. You know Sunspear well? He asked, and Ned shook his head. Cerdiman or the princess know it better than I. I spent most of my life in Blackhaven with Lord Beric and then in the Riverlands with the Brotherhood. Ned said sadly, "He was a good man, Lord Beric, though I only knew him for some short time, and by then I believe he was a different sort than he had been. He was a good man," he said. "The revivals took a lot out of him, Your Grace. I heard him and Thoros discuss it one night, when they thought me asleep. How each time he came back, he did so after losing another piece of himself, a part of him that made him a man being stripped away each time he fell." Ned said, his voice sounding even sadder, and his eyes now firmly focused on the ground in front of him. "Then the man he once was must have been a sight to behold," he said to a soft nod from the younger man. "That he was, Your Grace," Ned said before walking away. As he did so, Aegon was left wondering how much like his uncle Ned truly was. Did he carry much of Cerdian in him? If so, which parts? He was good and true, and he seemed honorable. The young man was one of the few lords that he'd met that he could find few faults in. Even when they had spoken about what he'd done with his cousin, Ned had listened and asked but one question. "Did he deserve to die, Your Grace?" That was it. As simple as that. Did he deserve to die? And once Aegon had told him what he had done, he hadn't even needed to answer that question. "Cerdian, was he anything like his nephew, Sir Jaime?" he asked, turning to the other man. "In some respects he was, Your Grace. He was less effusive and much quieter, but they share some traits," Jaime said. "Then the world is much poorer without him," he said. "That it is, Your Grace." He nodded to the knight, and the two of them walked back into the Red Keep. Today would be spent naming lords and taking oaths of fealty, and he looked forward to neither. There were elements to being a king that he cared not for: propriety, protocol, and procedures, that if he had his way he'd eliminate, and yet he knew they were needed. In time he and his wife would change Westeros for the better. For now they needed it to be stable as soon enough they would be leaving, not just for Dorne but for Essos too. Aegon made his way to the Tower of the Hand. He was eager to see Davos and to annoy the man a little. It wouldn't only be lords he didn't know personally who'd be named today. Walking up the steps, and then entering the room, he felt the smile appear on his face. As he heard the curses from Davos's Solar, he bid the guards not to announce him, and knocked on the door himself, and was soon treated to some of those curses directed at him. "I fucking told you I don't need anything, for fuck's sake, I'm not a fucking cripple," Davos said annoyedly. "Is that any way to speak to a king?" he said, entering the room. Davos looking at him and frowning as he did so. "It is when this is his fault," Davos said, looking at the papers strewn on his desk. "I told you to hire some men to help," he said, taking a seat across from him. "I'm the hand thanks to you," Davos said, and Aegon chuckled, deepening the frown on the man's face. "You really wanted to curse, didn't you?" he said, trying not to let the chuckle turn into a full laugh. "Fuck off, Your Grace," Davos said, both of them then giving in to it and laughing as Aegon poured the man an ale. "Drink," he said, and Davos nodded. He waited until he had taken a good swallow of it before he looked at him once again. Aegon's humor now tinged with concern. "Is it truly that bad?" he asked concernedly. "It takes some getting used to. We really need a master of coin, Aegon," Davos said, and he nodded. "I don't know who to trust, Davos. Jon, I believe, is a good man, and Varys has proved himself, Lord Paxter. I'll get to know more of when we set sail. You've earned both mine and Jackson's trust 10 times over, and that's why, despite it not being what you want, we need you as hand. Princess Arianne doesn't want a representative as of yet. She's far too concentrated on retaking Dorne," he said, shaking his head. "Have you spoken to the Vale Lords?" Davos asked. "Not yet. Speak to them and to Varys, Lady Anya especially," Davos said, and he looked at him curiously. "Why her?" he asked. "She had a run-in with Lady Sansa, Aegon," Davos said, and he didn't get to finish as Aegon rose quickly to his feet and was out the door before he did so. King's Landing, 305 AC. Dany, her dreams had been filled with images she'd long since forgotten. Men, women, and children treated as property, whipped, beaten, and some even killed at the whims of their masters. Each time that she felt she was sinking into a pit of despair, she felt his hands touching her and helping her out of it. His fingers in her hair or touching her back, his words soft and simple as he promised that together they would free them all. Between Aegon, Ghost, and Liar Hacks, they'd gotten her through both the immediate aftermath of Daario's words and the night that followed. So much so that when she woke the next morning, it was with an even greater resolve than she had shown in the throne room with Aegon. Then anger had been her guide. She'd been angry over what had happened, angry and determined to see her people free. Later it had been worry and concern she'd felt, most as thoughts of their suffering had threatened to overwhelm her. Now, though, she felt only resolve. A resolve that was soon strengthened even more when Aegon left her to speak with Missandei and Grey Worm. "You heard?" she asked them both, as they sat down at her table, all three of them breaking their fast together, though only she and Missandei really ate. "He lost the city," Missandei said. The sadness in her voice was one that she shared in. "He did, and we must take it back," she said determinedly. "We go to Meereen?" Grey Worm asked, an odd look on his face. "Aegon has agreed that once we take Dorne we set sail for Meereen," she said, and she saw Grey Worm nod. "Should we take the city back, my queen? When we leave it will fall again." Missandei said, and she reached out to take her by the hand. "I so much wish to be here, to sit on the throne of my family. I believed it was my birthright, my destiny, and I thought I'd left the Bay of Dragons in much better shape than I'd found it in. I thought I'd freed them and their lives, and the lives of their children would be lives without chains. But I made a mistake," she said, as Grey Worm looked at her curiously. "My queen?" Missandei said, confused. "I forgot who the masters were and what they were. As long as there are masters there will be chains, and I promise you both that this time I'll not make a mistake. This time I'll leave no master alive, and when I'm done, there will be no one to place a chain around another's neck," she said, looking to them both. "Are you with me?" she asked, almost softly. "Always my queen," Missandei said with a smile. "The Unsullied follow Queen Daenerys." "I follow Queen Daenerys," Grey Worm said. She hated that they were not to know peace. It had been what she had thought they'd receive, once the war for the throne was finished. A life without battles or wars, one where they could relax and grow old. That was not to be their life. Or at least not for some time. Aegon was with her, and that gave her more comfort than she could ever have asked for. Knowing that her closest supporters, her friends, were with her too made her feel as if she was doing something worthy. It was a feeling she'd known for a time, and one that she'd lost for a time too. Seeing how she'd been welcomed at first by the North had made her question herself and what she was doing. With Aegon's help, and then seeing the true Northmen, it had come back when they'd accepted her, and together they'd beaten the Night King and his army. As they rode south and gained more and more allies, it had grown, and yet it was different from how this was. True, they would change people's lives in Westeros for the better, but that change in Essos was far more dramatic. Here the chains were invisible ones. Though chains, all the same, be it of birth, status, or based on how much coin they had access to. Compared to an actual chain, a collar, a whip, however, Westerosi had it easy. "A man wishes to see you, your grace," Sarah Brienne said as she entered the room. "A man?" she asked curiously, looking to Grey Worm and Missandei. "The sellsword, your grace," Sarah Brienne said with a look that Dany wasn't quite sure of on her face. Dany nodded to Grey Worm and Missandei, the two of them rising to walk to the door, and then she told Brienne to send him in and then to ask Ser Jorah to come to her. The Lady Knight telling her that her bear was speaking to some men that he was considering for positions in the Dragon Guard. When Daenerys entered the room, she almost rose to her feet to wipe the smile off his face. He moved towards her, and Daenerys screeched at him, Dany smirking as the red dragon flew and landed on the table in front of her. "A new one?" Daario said, sitting down across from her. "She is," she said. "She?" he asked, raising his eyebrow. "Lodieric," she said to a confused look from him. "Name for mine, and my husband's mother's," she said. And she saw the brief wince on his face when she said, "husband." "Why would you name a dragon after some Westerosi?" he asked dismissively. Lodieric screeching at him once more before Daenerys then threw her some of the cooked meat that Missandei hadn't eaten. "Because he's a dragon just like me," she said, looking to see his reaction. "I find that hard to believe. You're the only dragon I've ever seen." Daario said, smiling at her. "You have not truly met my husband," she said, her own smile quickly stopping his. "He's rather small, isn't he?" Daario said, reaching down to grab some of the grapes that rested in the bowl. "Yet the shadow he casts is as large as mine own," she said proudly. And though she wasn't sure, she swore she heard a snort from the other side of the table, her eyes narrowing as she now looked at Daario. "And yet I wonder if my queen's needs are being sated. He doesn't seem the man to do so." Daario said, and she laughed loudly. "If you only knew how sated I am. Aegon is a man amongst men." Dario, a true king, a man who owns my heart and who leaves me breathless with merely a look. Compared to him, you are but a sparrow while he is a dragon, she said, enjoying the annoyed look that appeared on Dario's face. Will we be heading to Meereen, my queen? Dario asked, suddenly changing the subject. We will. I intend to take my city back, and I will not be stopping there, she said, seeing the smile that quickly appeared. Then I look forward to our travels, my queen, Dario said. And as he rose to walk from the room, she realized that he no doubt believed that it would be only her and he that was going to Meereen, Aegon in his mind needing to stay here and rule, and so she decided to shatter that illusion once and for all. My husband so looks forward to seeing the Bay of Dragons and to testing his sword against the men of Essos. Perhaps had it been Aegon that Meereen looked to for protection, then the city would still be a free one, she said with a smirk. Or perhaps my queen would now be a widow in mourning. Alas, it's something we shall never know. Dario said as he turned to walk from the room, and he was lucky he did so immediately. Lax looked in his direction and screeched loudly once more, and as Dario closed the door behind him, she saw the flash of white, where Ghost had been while Dario was in the room. She knew not, but she doubted he'd been far, and as she looked into his red eyes, she smiled, knowing that the wolf was protecting and not spying on her. Aegon had no need to concern himself about Dario. No need to feel jealous. She was his, and he was hers, and no one could or would come between them. King's Landing 305 AC. Lady Anya Waynwood. She'd not been granted an audience with the king and queen as of yet, but Anya had not wasted her time. Anya had gotten the lay of the land as best she could, while she waited for her chance to plead her case. There was something going on with Dorne that she wasn't aware of, and whoever that sellsword was, he had brought word that Meereen had fallen, something that had caused the king to send them all from the throne room without further explanation. It gave her much to ponder on, as did the rumors she heard about the small council. Lord Redrian, as master of ships, was the only true choice, as was Varys, as master of whisperers. She wasn't too aware of Ser Jorah Mormont, other than knowing he'd won a tourney in Lannisport many years earlier and had married one of the Hightowers. After that, not much had been heard about him, and though there was some scandal in the north about him some years later, she knew not what that had been about. He'd ended up in the Queen's service, and so that alone made him suitable to be the Lord Commander of the King's Guard, or Dragon Guard, as it was now known as. Anya's true surprise in that regard was that Jaime Lannister and a Lady Knight served there too. Finding out that the hand was Sarah Davos Seaworth had been another surprise, but then she'd heard from the Knights of the Vale who'd returned that he and the king were close, and any man was better suited than Tyrion Lannister for the role. Where the imp was she didn't know, nor care, but she was glad he was no longer in service to the Targaryens. A kinslayer truly was not a man that any in Westeros would wish to deal with. The biggest surprise was that Jon Connington was alive and well, and now served as Master of Laws. Though the man had brought the Golden Company to the side of the king and queen and should be rewarded for it. That he was and would be loyal to House Targaryen above others was an added reason for his appointment. She felt it left a position up for grabs, and she almost dared to dream that it could go to someone in the Vale. Was her own position more certain? She'd have almost demanded it, or as much as anyone can demand something of a king and queen with dragons at their beck and call. Gods. Dragons, she thought. The world was so very different now that they were back in the world. The rules that governed warfare no longer applied when dragons could be set upon an army. She shook her head and cleared her thoughts. She had work to do, and had already put her best guards on Harold to keep him in line. Anya rose from her chair to check up on her former ward, only to be stunned when her guards came into the room with the king himself walking purposefully in front of them. "Your Grace," she said, with a curtsy that belied her years. "Lady Anya, I believe you and I have much we need to speak on, my cousin. For starters." The king set his tone, leaving no doubt they would be speaking on it now. "Of course, Your Grace, a drink, some refreshments," she asked, and the king shook his head, but did take the seat when offered. "My cousin, my lady," the king asked, and Anya began to tell him the tale. Lady Sansa arrived in the Vale along with Theon Greyjoy. "Your Grace, Lord." Robert was most pleased to see his cousin and him. While there, I'm afraid to say, she spoke of her Grace and yourself in the most unflattering of ways. She claimed that you both forced her from her home and stole her birthright from her, Anya said to a loud snort from the king. "My cousin has a way with words, my lady," That those words are untruths matters not to her, he said, and she smiled and nodded. She and Lord Robert became close. Your Grace, the relationship turning romantic, though I must admit. I felt it to be a show on Lady Sansa's part. More than that, she had any genuine feelings for her cousin, she said, and saw the small nod of the king's head. While praying in the Sept one day, Lady Sansa was attacked. An assassin sent, I believe, by Cersei Lannister and dispatched by Theon Greyjoy. My cousin was unhurt? The king asked with no feeling whatsoever. She was your Grace. Later that night, Lady Sansa began to suggest it was you or her Grace that sent the assassin to kill her, she said, and the king smirked. My cousin has an active imagination, the king said, and she nodded. I and the other lords of the Vale didn't believe a word of it. Your Grace. Why would you, and if you wished her dead, it could have been done far easier and with a much greater chance of success, she said. But Lord Robert did, he asked, surprising her a little.
He did, Your Grace.
He was infatuated with Lady Sansa by this time. Lady Lysa had kept him well apart from how other young lords were raised, you see, and he led a very sheltered life. What other accusations did my cousin make? To Lord Robert and to the rest of the lords of the Vale. Lady Anya, the king asked, not responding in the slightest to her words. When the remainder of the knights sent with Lord Yain arrived bearing his body, Lady Sansa suggested that you, Your Grace, may have sought to see him fall, that you, and these are her words, not mine own, never forgave him for coming to your aid at the Battle of the Bastards, she said, and the king laughed loudly. My cousin knows very little of war. Why would any man bear a grudge against the men who saved his life? I admit, Lord Yak and I were not on the friendliest of terms, but I respected the man and was more than thankful for his and the Knights of the Vale's help, the king said. As Sir Davith and others were more than keen to attest to, Your Grace, Sir Davith especially speaks most highly of you and her Grace, and so once again, other than Lord Robert, Lady Sansa's words fell on deaf ears. Then I ask you pass on my thanks to Sir Davith, a good man and true and one the Vale should be most proud of. The king said, and she smiled at that, the king knowing how to play the game a little, it seemed. Arrangements were made for a wedding, Your Grace, between Lord Robert and Lady Sansa, and though I was not in favor of it, I bowed to my liege lord's wishes. It seems the gods, though, had a much different fate in store, however, as one morning Lord Robert was found dead in his bed. He'd been smothered with a pillow. Your Grace, she said, though that wasn't exactly what had happened, but it suited her more. By whom, my lady? The king asked with intrigue. We believe Lady Sansa to be responsible, Your Grace, she said to a furrowing of the king's brow. For what reason would she? If they were to be married, then she'd have no cause to see him dead. The king said, and she knew her next words would decide things. May I be blunt, Your Grace? She asked, and he nodded. It came to our attention that things had developed physically with Lady Sansa and Lord Robert. Certain, activities were taking place between them, and like most young men, Lord Robert was eager to speak of these in the most unflattering of terms. He bragged, the king asked, and she nodded. What happened to my cousin, Lady Anya? She told him of the trial, the result, and the exile, the king not showing any emotion as she spoke. The words, and she felt annoyed that she couldn't get a true read on him. It was clear he thought little of his cousin, the mere fact he named her as such proof enough of that as he named the Lady Arya, a sister true. Whether he'd have welcomed them killing her, or that he much preferred what they had done, wasn't as clear to her, however. What is it you seek, Lady Anya? The king asked, changing the subject far more quickly than she had expected him to. I seek to the Vale to be welcomed back into your good favor, Your Grace, yours and her graces, she said, noticing that when she mentioned the queen, the king seemed to ever so slightly relax. What makes you think that you're not already in them? The king asked. We were late, Your Grace, in dealing with Lady Sansa and the fallout from Lord Robert's death. We were late and couldn't come to swear our oaths and march for her Grace and for yourself, she said, trying to sound regretful. She felt it worked a little given the look on the king's face. We seek not to punish those who were late, my lady, nor to replace those who didn't fight against us. The Vale lost good men fighting in a war that the rest of the realm cared little about. Neither I nor my wife will hold it against you that you arrived late to a battle that was already won. The king said, I thank you, Your Grace, she said, with a smile. There is the matter of the naming of a new Lord of the Vale and Warden of the East. to be considered. I'd welcome your suggestion, Lady Anya, the king said, and she felt her heart race just a little. By right of blood, Sir Harold Harding is the heir to House Arryn, your grace. He was my ward for some time, and though he has some rough edges, were it my decision I'd see him named as both, she said, looking to the king. I shall take it under advisement, Lady Anya. We'll speak again when her grace and I have made our decision. I thank you, your grace. She watched him leave, and she wondered if she'd said and done enough. Only time would tell, but she felt that she had. She hoped that she had. There were opportunities here, ones that if she could take advantage would see her house rise high, ones that if she played wrong would see her house in flames. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. She thought, filling her glass with wine, the great game was never ending. River Run 305 AC. Sansa. Seeing River Run for the first time, Sansa couldn't help but be impressed. There were larger keeps in the Riverlands, and some had larger villages around them. Seaguard was almost a small city in of itself, but she doubted there was a prettier keep than this. They weren't welcomed with any formality, though, which annoyed her slightly. She was the niece of their lord, the granddaughter of their former lord, and she had assumed that would mean more than an old steward and some guards to greet her. Beggars couldn't be choosers, though, and in essence, that's what she was, a beggar in all but name. So she, for now, had to grin and bear it, and as Theon helped her from her horse, she put on her brightest smile, and curtsied to the steward as befitted a lady. The man looked at her oddly, his eyes roaming her face for such a long time that she felt even her put-on smile begin to falter. She was just about to say something to him when he spoke and apologized. Forgive me, my lady, but your mother was well known to me, and for the briefest of moments it was as if she was in front of me again. The man said with a warm smile, There is nothing to forgive, Surak. No, sir, my lady, Utherides, Wayne, steward to your uncle, Lord Edmure. If you and your companion will follow me, I'll take you to my lord, he said, and Sansa smiled at him and nodded. Inside the keep was as pretty as outside. It wasn't luxurious or dripping in obvious wealth, but it was well maintained and so very different from the gray walls of Winterfell, or the rather bare walls of the Gates of the Moon. There were tapestries and etchings, most of them showing some version of river life. Fishing, swimming, bathing were all depicted, as well as a rather large one of River Run itself, showing it surrounded by water on three sides. The image fascinated her so much that she for a moment forgot why she was here, and instead stood to look at it. In times of siege, the sluice gates are opened, my lady. The river floods the land, cutting the keep off from those who would wish to take it. Utherides said, And yet it's been taken, is it not? She said, and the man gave a sad nod. All keeps fall, my lady, and none. Not even Harrenhal can withstand a dragon's flames. Utherides said, his words sending a chill down Sansa's spine. She heard some revelry coming from what she assumed was the great hall. There was clearly singing and some playing of music, and yet it was past that and down a small corridor that she was taken. When she saw the two guards at the door, she knew this was her uncle Solar, and it didn't take it long for it to be confirmed to her. Despite her protest, Theon was told to remain outside, and Utherides led Sansa into the Solar, where she found her uncle rising to his feet to greet her.
By the seven, it is you?
Welcome to River Run, niece, her uncle said warmly, his smile true to her eyes, and she was more than pleased to see it so. Thank you, uncle. It's so good to finally be here, she said as he walked around from behind his desk and hugged her, before placing a kiss on her cheek. You're the very image of your mother, is that not so, Utherides? Edmure said, and the steward nodded, a smile also on his face. And yet, this one she felt to be less true for some reason. Long have I wished to see you, uncle. You and River Run, though I dared not come here when I traveled south, she said, as Edmure bid her sit and asked Utherides to see that refreshments were brought. For why, niece? Why would you fear coming to your kin? Edmure asked. Twice I've asked for aid, uncle. Twice I've called for aid from my kin, and twice I've been denied. When I marched to retake my home, I sent the Lady Brienne to speak to my granduncle, Sir Brendan, and he refused my call, and then as I traveled south, I sent word to you and received no reply, she said, playing up her upset rather than her anger. I cannot answer for my uncle, but for myself, what you asked for was not something I could provide. I named Jon Snow my king. Edmure began, but she interrupted him. But he's not Jon Snow, is he? You named him your king based on a lie, she said, and Edmure frowned at her. I knew it not at the time, and regardless of that, you would have asked me to go against dragons. Edmure said, shaking his head. I would have asked you to support your kin, uncle, no more or less, she said. And I will, Reborn. Welcomes you, Sansa, most happily, and you may stay as long as you wish. But I've now sworn to House Targaryen, as by now has the entire realm, and you should think of doing the same. Make peace with your cousin, and then push your claim for Winterfell. I'll even support you in doing so, he said, looking at her. I thank you, uncle. I find I'm most tired and hungry and in need of a bath and a change of clothes, she said, and Edmure rose to his feet just as Uberets walked back in with a servant. She was about to walk from the room when Edmure caught sight of Theon, her uncle's expression changing, though he said nothing, and she almost panicked, thinking he may. Instead, he simply sent for a different servant and had them both directed to rooms. And Sansa was soon laying in a warm bath and thinking on her next move. It was clear she wasn't going to get the full support she had hoped for, but partial would be enough. For now, she needed a power base, and without one, she was adds for. After washing and changing, she asked to be taken to Theon, and together they walked to the Great Hall. It was quite full, and though it wasn't a feast, it was as close to one as the few she'd been to in the Vale, and closer to any she'd been since the last time she was in the South. As in Stonehenge, Theon was not allowed to sit with her if she wished to sit, the high table, and she knew that she needed to. Not only was it from there that she could best judge the moods of some of the other men in the Riverlands, but it was where she belonged. So they parted, and she found herself next to a young woman of around her own age that she soon found out was her good aunt. Sansa, my wife Lady Rosalind, I'd introduce you to your cousins, but it's late and they're already abed. Edmure said, and Sansa smiled and nodded at the other woman. My lady, she said as she looked her over. She was rather plain, she thought, and as she looked at her all she could think of was that Robb had lost his crown, because he'd not married her. It was something that must have been clear in her face as Lady Rosalind shot her a look that she didn't much like. Rosienne, the woman said, and Sansa knew she had to be just as courteous. Sansa, she said, smiling, and saw the nod of approval her uncle gave her. The conversation was stilted, and she saw Lord Bracken speaking to Edmure. Her uncle then turned to her to ask her if it was true about Sweet Robin. She willed the tears to come, and they did, both her uncle and Lord Bracken, as well as one of the knights at the table, almost falling over themselves to hand her a handkerchief so she could dry her eyes. By the time she made her way to her bed that night, she was sure they all felt sympathetic to her plight. Though the Lady Rosalind seemed anything but, and Sansa knew she'd be a problem, as she turned out to be over the next few days. Each time that Sansa managed to steer the conversation to how wronged she'd been, and how much she feared that Jon and the Dragon Whore wanted her dead, it was Rosalind more than any who challenged her. Anytime she felt she scored a hit, it was Rosalind who made sure it didn't land how she'd wished. The worst of those had been when she was speaking of how Jon hated her mother and was now taking out that hatred on her daughter. How that was something that had become clearer to her the longer she thought about it. I believe you're mistaken, Sansa, Rosalind said, her uncle, Lord Bracken, and the knights she'd found out were Sir Mark Piper and Sir Carl Vance. Looked not to her, but to Rosalind. Forgive me, Lady Rosalind, but I believe I'm better placed to understand my cousin and his wife better than you. I spent far more time with them both, she said almost haughtily. Indeed, and no one here would deny that. However, my husband spoke to your sister, Lady Arya, who by then King Aegon had already offered Winterfell to. He'd offered to make her both Lady and Warden. Is that not right, Edmure? Rosalind asked. Indeed he had, and it was only her own reluctance that had stopped it from being so, which I spoke to her about, Edmure said as the others nodded. So, it seems strange to me that the king would favor one sister over the other if he truly bore a grudge against their mother, Rosienne said. Brazier and he were always close, Lady Rosalind, and my sister takes more after my father in looks than I. I believe when I'm looked upon, it's more my mother that is seen, she said, almost petulantly, though she didn't notice the look she was given when she did so, as her eyes were focused far too intently on the other woman. Perhaps it's because Lady Arya didn't seek a crown to call her own, Rosalind said. Sansa was furious, but she knew she couldn't speak out, not right then. So instead she made it look as if she was pondering the woman's words. It killed any more talk of the sort that she liked that day, and instead talk turned to Theon, and she then had to defend him. But they listened, she welcomed. But again, it was Lady Rosalind, whose points were made far better than her own. Sansa saying that he'd saved her life, not once but twice, not being accepted as eagerly as the words that Rosalind spoke once she'd done so. Rosalind bringing it up that had he not done what he'd done in the first place, then the war would have taken on a much different turn. She had no comeback for that. Each of the men in the room had all suffered greatly through that war, and most of those responsible were now dead. To have someone to focus some of their hurt and blame on left her in a terrible position. The aunt's good deeds got him leave to stay. His bad ones and her own closeness with him painted her in a terrible light, and Sansa was left cursing that she had been outplayed by a Frey of all people. A member of the worst family in the realm who had almost married a king and had lucked into marrying the Lord of Riverrun, had managed to outplay her, and while she held her tongue then, she did not when she and Theon were alone. Who does she think she is? An up-jumped weasel. Had we not needed to cross a bridge, then she'd be still rotting in the twins. Her words grew louder and louder, and Theon did his best to calm her down, to no avail. She was in mid-rant when the door opened, and she swore the woman planned it and timed it to perfection. Sansa was caught shouting out that she wished her sister had killed the woman in the twins as well as the men, just as Edmure, Rosaline, and their two babes walked into the room. "You out," Edmure said to Theon. "Rosier, leave me and my niece alone. Take the children back to the nursery," Edmure said, his anger clear. Sansa felt worried for her safety. She need not have. It was her welcome here that was in danger, and not her body. "I welcomed you into my home, and you speak of my wife, so. Your sister told me that you had turned into a hateful, spiteful woman, and I refused to believe it. I welcomed you as my kin, but it seems that you don't know the meaning of the word. You're jealous of what others have, and feel the world owes you a debt. Well, let me let you into a little secret, niece. The world owes all of us fucking nothing. What we have, what we get is what we deserve, and I fear the life you deserve is one alone and without family," Edmure said. "Uncle, Save your lies for someone who believes them. You may stay the night and on the morrow. I'll see you escorted to wherever you may wish to go. I'll even give you coin to travel, as that's what family does for one other. But you are no longer welcome in my halls, and once you leave I have no wish to ever hear from you again. Your mother would be ashamed of you, Sansa Stark. Thoroughly ashamed, as am I." When she left the next day, she didn't look back once as they rode to Seaguard. There was nothing for her back there, and only by looking forward could she keep her composure. There was no other choice for her now. It was to be the Iron Islands. This is what her life had descended to. A rock wife with no husband. King's Landing 3005 AC. Davos! A lordship. Him. What was that fool of a boy thinking? Lord Davos Seaworth of Cape Wrath with further lands and no one to pass them on to. Thank the gods he'd convinced Aegon not to give him an even bigger keep, even if it had come at the cost of accepting a lordship in the process. Had he an heir to leave it to then, he'd have welcomed both the lordship and even the offer of a larger holding. But he had no one, and that time was long past. It wouldn't even do Merya much good, only that it would make her life more comfortable and then be passed along to one of her brother's children. So he'd accepted the lordship because his king had requested it of him. And he'd sent the letter to Merya telling her that she was now in charge of larger holdings. It wouldn't bridge the gap between them, and he doubted he'd receive a letter from her in return. Time, distance, and the loss of a son had turned what had been a good marriage into one that he was no longer welcome in. He sighed as he got up from his seat and made his way to the throne room. There were appointments to be made and ceremonies to be held. Ones that his part in was his hand and not thankfully for his own naming. He nodded to his guards, the group of Unsullied and Northmen that he'd become close to over time, and they began the long walk to the Red Keep proper. They were only halfway there when he was called to the gates, Davos hurrying after the men of the Golden Company and almost bursting out laughing when he saw the man who stood there. "Tell them to move their swords before I stick them up their arses, Onion Knight," Tormund said, and Davos chuckled as he told the guards to do just that. "What the fuck are you doing here?" he asked as the man embraced him, his smiling face a most welcome sight. "It's fucking dull beyond the wall. The people are building. Building is boring. Being with Jon Snow was never boring. I had hoped to catch you in the middle of a fight, but I arrived too late." "Tell me the fighting's not done," Tormund asked hopefully. "You've arrived just in time, my friend. The fighting's nowhere near done. Come. You'll be pleased to see I, and you'll get to see men kneel," Davos said. "The big woman is here," Tormund asked, and Davos laughed. "Aye, she is," he said, and Tormund quickened his steps as they moved into the Red Keep. The large man garnered some odd looks as they walked to the throne room, and was the result of many hushed whispers when they entered it. Yet, when the king saw him and almost raced from the throne to embrace him, they stopped immediately. The warm smile on Aegon's face as he looked at Tormund was as true a one as he ever wore, and Davos could see it return just as truly. How? Why? The free folk they are well? Aegon asked, after he moved from the larger man. Aye, they're well, King Crow. I came for a fight. Am I in the right place? Tormund asked, and Aegon laughed as he patted the man's shoulder. Very much so. Yeah, go on, the queen said firmly, and Davos swore that Tormund laughed so loudly that the sound boomed around the room. Go, Jon Snow. We'll talk soon. Tormund said, and Aegon embraced him once more before heading back towards the Iron Throne, only to stop and turn with a smirk on his face as he did so. My lords, my ladies, good sirs, I give you Tormund Giant's Bane, the tall talker, hornblower, breaker of ice, husband to bears, the mead king of Ruddy Hall, speaker to gods, and father of hosts, hero of the war for the dawn, and a man I am proud to name a brother by choice. The king said, I bid you welcome him, as you would a true hero, for that is what he is. Davos listened as the room began to clap, and Tormund glared at the king, who was smiling and winking at him. The man's own laughter soon ringing out loudly as he turned and spun as if he was presenting himself. I'll fucking gut him for this, Tormund said to him under his breath, Davos finding his own laughter soon coming, as he looked at Aegon and then turned back to Tormund. When it quietened down, he nodded to Grey Worm, who came and stood with Tormund while he walked and took his place beside the king. It was Princess Arianne who came first, and was recognized as the Princess of Dorne. Arianne swearing her fealty before moving away, Lord Dany came next and did the same. Davos, hearing the Sword of the Morning mentioned more than once. Then came Sir Davin and Lady Joy Hill, who'd arrived only the day before, and Davos could hear people speak Cersei's name as they looked to the lady. It was an apt description, he thought, in looks, if not in personality, as the lady was a much different sort. The Westerland swears fealty to their graces King Aegon and Queen Daenerys of the House Targaryen, and House Lannister renews its oath to House Targaryen in perpetuity. Sir Davin said, as did Lady Joy, the knight kneeling while the lady held a perfect curtsy. Arise, Sir Davin, as our Warden of the West, and arise, Lady Joy Lannister, the future Lady of Casterly Rock, the Queen said, and both the knight and the lady smiled, as they did so. Then it was Lord Edric Storm's turn, along with the Lord of the Stormlands, the young man kneeling as he looked around the room as if he was seeking someone out. Whoever it was, he didn't find it, and quickly began to swear his oath, the words seeming true enough to Davos's ears. Arise as Lord Edric Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End and Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, the Queen said, Edric smiling as he did so. Next it was the Lords and Lady of the Vale. He and Aegon had spoken of what to do with the Vale, and he knew that Varys had spoken privately to the King and Queen as well. He now stood like the others in the room awaiting their decision. House Arryn renews its oath of loyalty to House Targaryen, and I swear mine own and my house's in perpetuity, Sir Harold said as the room hushed. House Arryn is no more, and its name shall be confined to history. Arise, Lord Harold, Harding Lord of the Vale and Warden of the East. The king said, surprising some, including him. He'd thought he'd name the man an Arryn if he chose him as Warden. That he was not sent a message, though. House Waynwood swears its oath to their graces King Aegon and Queen Daenerys of the House Targaryen, and I swear my house to yours in perpetuity. Lady Anya said, and it took some time for either the king or queen to answer, the queen finally doing so. Arise, Lady Waynwood, as the new mistress of Coin, the queen said to gasps, none louder than the one from the lady herself. The vase looked to see a small smile on Princess Arianne's face, and on some of the ladies in the throne room there were some scowls on some of the lords' faces, but more seemed pleased than not. Your graces honor me, I don't know what to say. Lady Anya said, her shock still clear. That you'll accept is all that's needed to be heard, my lady, the queen said. Then I accept with great humility and much appreciation, your grace, Lady Anya said. Lord Leighton and his heir stepped forward, and Davos looked to see them staring at Lady Melora, who stood to the left of the king. He watched as they too knelt, and then the king spoke and named Lord Leighton as the Warden of the South. Lord Paxter and his youngest son stepped forward once that was done, and both swore their oaths, and Davos saw Aegon look to Daenerys, and then her small nod. "Arise, Lord Targaryen, Lord of Highgarden," the queen said, and the boy smiled almost as brightly as the orange of his hair. On and on it went, and he was soon getting bored himself. Davos unsurprised to see the yawn that came from Tormund. As the last oath was sworn and the king and queen rose from their seats, he saw Aegon look to the sellsword, who had entered the room without him noticing, and he closed his eyes to offer up a prayer to the gods that there would be no trouble. He was more than pleased that it seemed there would be none, and yet whatever the man said when Aegon walked past him put paid to that. The man had clearly angered him greatly, and yet he watched him simply nod to the sellsword and then bid him to follow. Tormund steered Isengay following behind them also. Davos, the queen, and others almost rushed outside after them, and he was glad to see the king take his sword off and hand it to Cersei. "What is the fool doing?" the queen said, annoyedly. "At least he's not bearing steel, your grace," he said to no reply. The two men were in the courtyard, and he couldn't hear what was being said. A little way off them stood Sargyame, who didn't look concerned, and Tormund, who wore as big a smile as he'd ever seen him wear. Davos, the queen, and the lords and ladies of Westeros all looked on with no true idea of what was to happen, and then he heard a dragon roar, and he began to chuckle. King's Landing 3005 AC. "Aegon!" He and Dany had spoken to Varys about Sir Harold and Lady Anya, the Master of Whisperers confirming what the lady had said about Sansa and Lord Robert, and that his cousin was now at Riverrun. It bothered him not where she was, and yet he told Varys to make sure he knew her location at all times. His wife and he then made the choices for the realm, or to be more precise, Dany made the choices and he agreed with her. There was no fault that he could find in any of the arguments she put forward, and he had no wish to contradict or challenge her on any of the decisions. She had a better read of the politics than he, and though he had somewhat a read on the people, it wasn't enough to cause him any doubts. The one disagreement they had was over naming Sir Harold as his own name rather than as Lord Arryn. Aegon wished the house removed from the realm, and though it was for tatty reasons, they were reasons he'd not let go. "I was named for that man. My uncle took his honor from him, and that honor not only gave me the life it did, but it cost me 2 brothers and many years with my sister. It's not for that alone, though I wish them gone, nor even for the part they played in the rebellion and in seeing the Stacked on the throne. It's for what that honorable man did when the bodies of my brother and sister were laid out in front of his king," Aegon said. "What did he do?" Dany asked. "Nothing. Not a damn thing. As high as honor indeed. Not only did he not see that the men responsible faced justice, but he rewarded the man who gave the order by making his daughter the queen. Jon Arryn fucked this realm up more than any other man, including Aerys, so fuck him and fuck his house. It died with him and with his son," he said, and Dany nodded. That she then agreed with him only made him less likely to challenge her own decisions, and when she suggested Lady Anya as mistress of coin, he found no reason to argue either. It would send a message, Dane said, and in this, his wife had been right, as she usually was. She'd talked to him about Daario, and though she'd not asked him not to lose his temper with the man, he knew she wished he would not. "You know he means nothing to me, don't you?" she said as she kissed him deeply. "I know my wife's heart is as true as mine own. I can dislike the man, though, right?" he said with a chuckle. "Aegon, make fun of him a little," he said, laughing still. "Aegon," she said reproachfully. "I'll play nice," he said, after a few moments, before Dany then told him that both Lyhax and Ghost weren't playing nice when he had come to see her. He knew that they would need the man in Essos, and so he had resolved to ignore him as much as he could. In the throne room, seeing that Tormund had come to King's Landing and would be by his side once more made that even easier. Aegon had noticed Daario at the back of the room right from the moment he had sat down. He'd seen how he looked at him and at his wife. It was he knew all too well. One that had been directed at him for most of his life. A look that said he was unworthy, and while he knew that was true in relation to Dany, this man had no right to think himself any worthier. When he'd first seen the man, he'd not been jealous of him. His wife's reaction to his visit left her feelings in no doubt. Her reassurances to him about Daccio were unneeded, though he welcomed them regardless. If anything, the man disappointed him greatly, and he knew that he should have listened to Ser George more when he'd asked him about him, rather than build him up as something else in his head. Dany and he hadn't spoken much about their previous lovers. He'd heard of Drogo and of Dakio, and had told her of Ygritte's, but in some ways he preferred his wife's way of looking at things than his own. "If I look back, I'm lost." "Yeah, Aegon," she said softly as they lay in their bed. He knew that feeling all too well, though when he looked back, he had more years to look back on than she, and more wrongs that needed righting because of it. Daario was simply not good enough for her. Missandei had said so, Ser Daario had said so, and seeing the man in the flesh, that was what he had felt too. So he had tried to ignore him and had succeeded mostly. Even seeing him in the throne room, he'd not paid him much attention. Less so when Tormund arrived, but as he was walking to speak to his friend, it was then that Daario decided he had no wish to be ignored. "My queen looks bored. It's an odd thing for me to see, as I never remember her wearing that expression when she was in Meereen. Perhaps it's the place," Daario said, as Aegon brushed past him. "Or the company. Or perhaps she's trying not to let loose the dragon on the man who lost her city. Be thankful, my queen wears such an expression. Naharis, for I've seen her when the dragon is woken, and on days like that, only a king can calm her," he said, moving to go by the man. Tormund looking at him curiously. "And what makes you a king other than a crown?" Daario asked. "Step outside and I'll be more than happy to show you." He now stood face to face with the other man, an eager look on the sellsword's face as he waited for the spar to begin. Aegon didn't need to look to where she was standing, as he could feel her eyes were on him. Moving to Ser Jaime, he took off his sword and handed it to the knight, nodding that all was well as he did so. "I thought," he heard Daario say, and Aegon looked past him to where Tormund stood, a smile on his friend's face as he looked at him. It was one he happily returned. Having him here was a boon to his spirit, and having him with him for what they were about to do was something that he was most grateful for. Kneeling down on the ground, Aegon closed his eyes and felt him nearby. He didn't even have to call him, as Rigel was already on his way, and he felt the others coming too. The sound of the loud roar of the green dragon drowned out the sound of the smaller dragon's just as fierce one, and it was Lycurix that arrived first. The red dragon had flown from their room and now landed in front of him. The loud screech that she made in Daario's direction, one that was heard by one and all. Aegon moved and stroked her head, the dragon trilling as he did so, and leaning into his touch. Her eyes were on Daario all the time, though, her meaning clear, and then Aegon smiled as I saw the white wolf move from behind the man. That had made Daario almost jump a couple of feet, brought laughs from those watching, but not from Aegon himself. Instead, he just reached out, as Ghost licked his hand and then his face before he sat down in front of him, facing Daario as he did so. He looked to Tormund, who was laughing loudly, and then he heard the beat of the wings. Yaxloi calling out to her much larger brother, who landed gracefully behind them. As one they moved to the green dragon, Yaxloi flying to land in front of Rocco, while he and Ghost walked to join them both. Once he got there, he leaned in and placed his head against Rocco's snout, the green dragon trilling as he did so, while Aegon began to whisper softly to him. Looking to the balcony where Dany stood with Davos, Ser Jorah, and Ser Brienne, he smiled. In the bay, the fleet had already arrived, and soon they'd be setting sail for Doran. A battle was on the horizon, and a war was to follow, one that would take them some time to win, and one his wife wished this man to be a part of. He had no time for silly games such as this, but a message needed to be sent, so he stroked Rhaegal's snout, and then Lycurix's before he rubbed Ghost softly behind his one ear, and then moved so close to Davrio that he and he alone would hear his words. "Only a dragon can love a dragon," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and as he did so, Road Yackle roared loudly. King's Landing 305 AC. Jaime, after Aegon had put Daario firmly in his place, he had made it even more clear to any who doubted it that she was his, and he was hers. Rhaegal had flown to be with Drogon, and Lariax had, once Aegon had stroked her back and whispered words of praise to her, flown to the balcony and landed beside her. The red dragon was growing quickly, and her own time with her, and seeing Aegon with her, brought back memories of Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion when they were that size, and they felt a need to show off for her approval. Lord Yerison was proud of every little thing she did, and she wished her parents to be proud of her too, which they both were. Once she'd been praised, and Daario had been shown what a true dragon looked like. Exley then had one more lesson he wished to teach him, one that Daddy had enjoyed very much. He had moved quickly up the stairs, and made his way to her, with a look in his eyes that she knew all too well. The kiss they shared was long and passionate, and Daddy had found herself both wishing they were alone, and yet glad they were not. Her husband was letting everyone, and especially Daddy-O, know just what they felt for each other, and Daddy was only too happy to play her part. Later, after they had made love in their bed and had done so even more loudly than they usually did, Dany had found herself laying on her side and looking down on Aegon as he lay beside her. Her fingers traced over his scars, and she could see that though his eyes were closed, he was fully awake. The small smile he wore on his face, one that she really liked seeing, she had no doubt that she wore one that was similar, one of contentment, of true contentment, something she had been sure was a feeling she would ever know. "What are you thinking, my love?" she asked as she moved her hand from his chest to his face, her fingers brushing over his full lips. "Happy thoughts," he said, and she giggled as she kissed his cheek. "As am I," she said. "Did I go too far today?" he asked, still with his eyes closed. "I had worried you may," she said, and he opened them to look at her. "Killing a fool would bring you no glory, my love," she said, and he chuckled. "Aye, and the warm, fuzzy feeling would have lasted only moments," he said, before rolling his eyes and making her laugh. "I had thought it was your intent, Aegon. Why was it not?" she asked curiously. "As you say, the man is a fool, a man who wants what he cannot have," Aegon said, and she nodded her agreement before speaking it aloud. "He cannot," she said determinedly. "No, he cannot, nor can anyone else. The world and everyone in it will just have to make do with knowing that they cannot. None but the dragon inside of you will ever know my wife's heart as I do," Aegon said, and she kissed him deeply. She snuggled up against him and felt his fingers brush over her stomach, the swelling of it even more pronounced now. A part of her feared that he'd have asked her to stay here while he dealt with Dorne, that they would argue and fall out when he tried to protect her from the battles to come. Yet while he was protective, he had not once even suggested that she did not march with them, that she not fly on Drakon's back or ride her horse in the desert sands. If anything, it was her own worries for him that they had discussed far more than his for her, though she knew he felt them keenly. Isiarn had promised her that he'd not take the same sort of risks as he had already, and Dany had, in turn, promised herself that she'd take none. It was only a few days later, when they were set to depart to Dorne, that Aegon had brought up his own worries for her in words. Dany had been getting measured for armor when he had walked in, and whether it was seeing her swollen belly and the armor that covered it, or something else, she couldn't be sure. But when she had seen the worried look on his face, she had known what was coming. She quickly sent everyone from their rooms and moved to her husband. Aegon was sitting quietly, and she could see he was trying to choose his words carefully. Aegon began. "I know, I feel it too, Aegon. With you each time that you do something, you should not. My heart stills and my worries threaten to overwhelm me. Dany, you, the babe, You wish me to stay here and to be safe, to not risk myself," she said, and he nodded. "As do I with you, Aegon. But we cannot," he said, as he looked at her. "I'll not risk myself any more than is needed in the fight. I'll not be reckless. I'll not charge into the battle as I normally do. I swear it to you both," he said, so earnestly that it took her breath away. "And I'll stay safe, Aegon. I and our babe will be safe. With you," she said. And he took her into his arms, his hand on her stomach as his other hand touched her face. Why Lyads felt that moment needed her presence, she didn't know, but the red dragon flew and landed beside them. The sounds it made, ones that she felt were her way of telling them both that she would protect each of them. And when she heard Aegon laugh, she joined him. "I think that's her way of saying she's coming as well," Aegon said, and Dany heard the loud chirp that Ludiarix made that proved him right. Later, when they climbed up onto the dragons, Dany looked on and shook her head as Lyax flew to Aegon's side and landed on Rhaegal's back. She could fly for longer now and was growing larger, but she could not fly this first part of their journey on her own. Seeing her in front of Aegon as they ready to take to the air, Dany couldn't wipe the smile from her face. It looked right, it felt right, and so, with a last look to Davis and Arya, she gave the command and Drogon was soon flying out to sea. King's Landing, Dorne 305 AC. Arianne. She looked on as the ships were loaded and was amazed both at just how many there were and how quickly it was managed. Her entire army, half the Unsullied, half the Dothraki, and then finally her and Daemon themselves were all ready to sail to Dorne, and it brought a large smile to her face. After she had knelt and had spoken to the king and queen, they had told her they'd not delay, and they had lived up to their word. As she looked to the sky, she watched the dragons fly over her head, the king and queen on their backs, and then almost as one, the ships began to leave. Arianne stood on the deck of the ship with Daemon, Sarella, and Ned Dane as they left the bay. The young lord had quickly become someone that she had learned to trust completely. He was not overly ambitious, and he loved Dorne as much as she did. Were it not for Daemon, then, she felt that he would have been an ideal match. As it was, that was out of the question for either of them, but as she saw him speak to Sarella, another thought came to mind. One she was most eager to get Daemon's opinion on. "Walk with me," she said, turning to Daemon, and he nodded before following her down to her cabin. "I would love to see Quentyn's face," Daemon said, making her smile. The first one she had in relation to her brother since she'd found out what he had done. "I wonder if at heart my brother is still the coward he always was," she asked, as they entered her cabin. "People don't change, Arry, not truly," Daemon said, and she nodded. After closing her door, Daemon immediately went and grabbed the bottle of wine and poured them both a glass. Arianne taking a seat and then sipping the wine while Daemon sat down across from her. "Ned Dane," she asked, and he looked at her curiously. "A good man, Arry, one who is on your side completely," Daemon said. "I know that him and Sarella, what think you?" she asked, and he chuckled. "Arianne the matchmaker," Daemon said, raising his hands, and she couldn't help but laugh at the way he did so. "Do you think them a good match?" she asked as she took another sip of the wine. "I do, though I think you may be easier to convince than Sarella," Daemon said, before adding, "Or perhaps not," he chuckled again. "Daemon? Sarella is not one who sees marriage in her future. But perhaps that's because she feels it would inhibit her. Confine her, Ned Dane would not. Once she knew this, then perhaps—" She smiled at that. Arianne knew full well what her cousins were like, and then almost as soon as she did so, she felt the sadness come over her. Would that they'd not been so stupid, so crazed, and so in need of vengeance. Would that they were still here with her today when she needed them most. Placing the wine glass on the table, she reached into her dress for her handkerchief when she felt the tears in her eyes, and as always Daemon was there to wipe them before she had the chance to. He didn't say anything to her, either, just took her in his arms and let her sob for the kin she missed so terribly. It was a couple of hours later that she woke. Daemon had lain her down on the bed and covered her with a sheet, and he rested beside her, waking up almost the same moment she did, and looking at her concernedly. Again, he didn't say much, he just let her rub her hand over his face, and show that she was feeling better somewhat. He kissed her lips softly and then rose and walked to the door, looking back at her and nodding before leaving the cabin. A few moments later, there was a knock on the door and her handmaidens entered. Arianne quickly washed her face in the water they brought and allowed them to fix her hair before she headed to the large open cabin to eat her meal. After eating and laughing with Ned Dane and Sarella and then leaving the two of them alone together, she once again made her way to the deck and stood looking out on the water in front of them. They were somewhere in the narrow sea, and though the other ships were only shadows that were broken by the occasion light, it was still an impressive sight, even in the darkness of the night sky. Around her, more than 100 small little lights could be seen, and she wondered if the king and queen were now on a ship, or were they still in the sky somewhere. "We will take it back, Yari. It will once again kneel to its princess," Daemon said as he put his arms around her. "Quentyn?" she asked. "You know what must be done, be it by my blade or by the king's, Arry." Quentyn signed his death warrant the moment he took Sunspear. "He is my brother," she said softly. "Which only makes his betrayal all the more biting," Daemon said, and she nodded, happy that he knew her so well. "His army, do you think the king and queen are right and they await us in the Bonway?" she asked. "They do. It's where I would wait. And as they said, Arry, they think we'll march, not sail." "You are ready?" she asked worriedly, knowing his own part was perhaps the most dangerous, and turning to face him. "I am," he said, and she kissed him. Before then making him promise to come back to her and telling him that she loved him, laughing when he said that her love made him invincible. A few days later, they were in the Sea of Dorne, and then they were passing the Stepstones. Arianne was sure that she'd seen the dragons take off from one of the islands. Though Daemon said she was mistaken, when they passed by Ghost Hill, she felt her heart begin to race, as it did when they passed the coves and bays that led to Sunspear itself. Eventually they reached the point from which they'd sail no more, and just as quickly as the ships had filled, they were emptied. The king and queen's men and horses, first, and Arianne almost shuddered at the thought of the Darky riding through her lands. Then came the Dornish army, and finally the Unsullied. Arianne was not adept in military tactics, and when she had spoken to Daemon and Ned about it and asked why the ships wouldn't just sail into Sunspear, She'd been surprised by their answers. To her, it would be all the more impressive and imposing, the ships arriving en masse and taking the docks and working out from there. Daemon and Ned, though, both told her they'd lose far too many men in taking the docks. They'd then have to fight through the streets of the Shadow City itself, and it would nullify the dragon's effectiveness. The plans they had made were far better, they both insisted, and Arianne was glad to defer to them on matters such as this. As the small boat took her to the shore, she looked to see the king walking with Sir Jaime Lannister and the wilding behind him. The three men organizing their men and readying for the ride to Sunspear. She looked around to see where the queen was, and soon found her a little way off. Daenerys was on a hill, overlooking everything, and was sitting on a beautiful white mare, and so after Daemon had procured her own horse, Arianne rode towards her. When she got close enough to see her, she could see her two dragon guard were behind her, and to her surprise, the red dragon was resting on the ground beside her. It had grown larger and was perhaps now as big as a dog, and as she neared the queen, it let out a small warning roar. "Be calm, my love. Princess Arianne is a friend," the queen said, and the dragon looked from Arianne to the queen and then flew into the air so the queen could touch it more easily. Almost as soon as it felt the queen's hand on its scales, it made a sound that Arianne had never heard before, a sound she assumed to be one of joy given the look on the queen's face. Then the dragon landed back on the ground and almost seemed to curl up into a ball, and Arianne wondered if it was sleeping now. "Your Grace," she said, as she moved her horse closer to join the queen. "Princess, your lands are very beautiful, and I believe that my husband has fallen in love with them somewhat," the queen said, and Arianne followed her eyes to where the king was now moving down in the valley below them. "He was born here, your grace," Arianne said, a little proudly. "And perhaps he would have known a different life had he been brought up here," the queen said, almost wistfully. "Bastards are treated differently in Dorne, your grace. Mine own cousins and my love are proof of that. While the shame of their birth is something the rest of the realm believes, in Dorne we believe that the contents of their heart matter far more," Arianne said, and despite the fact that Aegon was no longer considered a bastard, she knew it had been a hard life for him to be raised as one. "Then my husband did miss out," the queen said softly. Arianne felt the queen no longer wished to discuss her husband's life experiences or what may have been, and so she decided not to speak on how the life we lead makes us who we are meant to be. Aegon and Daenerys had both suffered in their lives. They had both lost people they cared about and family they loved. It had made them who they were, and the realm needed them as who they were and not as who they could have been. "How long until we reach Sunspear?" the queen asked. 3 days, your grace," she said, and the queen nodded. "I look forward to seeing it." "As do I, your grace, as do I," she said, smiling.